Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I got the job at the special needs unit in late August, just before the new school year started. It wasn't a teaching position. I was more of a classroom assistant, helping with paperwork, assisting the kids with their routines, and keeping things organized while the teacher handled lessons. The school itself was large and modern, having been renovated a few years prior. The main hallways were bright, with polished floors, updated lighting, and new technology in every room. But our unit, tucked into the farthest wing of the building, hadn't been touched. It was a separate world from the rest of the school. Our 5 classrooms were in the oldest section of the building, left as they had been decades ago. The floors creaked, the paint on the walls had started to yellow, and the smell of old wood and dust lingered in the air, no matter how often it was cleaned. The ceilings were high, and the doors were thick, heavy wood, different from the newer ones elsewhere in the school. The windows were huge, reaching almost from floor to ceiling, but the glass was warped and streaked, letting in a strange, dim light on cloudy days. My desk was positioned at the back of the classroom, separate from the teachers, which was at the front. The 5 autistic students in our class were on different levels. Some could communicate fairly well, while others were mostly nonverbal. Each had their own routines, their own ways of interacting with the world, and our job was to help them navigate it in a way that made sense to them. It was fulfilling work, but it could also be exhausting. From the very beginning, things felt off in that classroom. One of the first things I noticed was the interactive whiteboard. Like every other classroom in the school, we had one mounted at the front. It was an older model, and it was a little glitchy sometimes, but it worked well enough for playing educational videos and songs for the kids. We used it daily, especially for sensory-friendly videos that helped some of the students stay engaged. Every afternoon, before taking the kids outside for recess, I would shut it off. The screen would go dark, the sound would cut out, and the room would go silent. But when we came back, it was on again, playing videos as if someone had pressed play while we were gone. At first, I assumed I had just forgotten to turn it off properly. Maybe I had left a video paused, and it had automatically resumed. So the next day, I was extra careful. I watched the screen go completely black before stepping out with the students. But when we returned, it was playing again. It didn't happen every time, but often enough to unsettle me. I mentioned it to the teacher once, expecting her to find it strange, but she barely reacted. Just shrugged and moved on, like it was nothing. I tried to ignore it. Maybe the board had a faulty power connection. Maybe a timer was set somewhere in its settings that I didn't know about. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then other things started happening. One morning, the teacher came in carrying a massive clear plastic bag full of toddler toys, colorful plastic rings, toy cars, light-up keyboards, and stuffed animals that played music. She had found them at a garage sale and thought they'd be good for the kids. Some of them loved anything with flashing lights or music, so having extra toys on hand was always helpful. She leaned the bag against the side of her desk, greeted me, and then left to attend a meeting in the classroom next door. The kids weren't in the room yet. It was still early, and I was alone at my desk, focused on paperwork. The only sounds were the soft scratching of my pen against the paper and the occasional hum of the building's old ventilation system. Then, out of nowhere, every single toy in that bag turned on at once. A chorus of electronic beeps, chimes, and mechanical voices filled the air. Toy cars revved their tiny engines, plastic animals sang nursery rhymes in garbled, tinny voices, and blinking lights flashed wildly inside the bag. I froze. My body locked up as I stared at the bag, my mind racing for a logical explanation. The toys weren't touching anything. No one had pressed their buttons. They were just sitting there, untouched, screaming to life all at once. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. My heart was pounding. I turned on my heel and walked straight out of the classroom, barely remembering to close the door behind me. The meeting was happening in the next room. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling my face go pale as I tried to steady my breathing. I told them what had happened. The teacher barely reacted. "It was probably the ghost," she said, barely glancing up from her notes. The other staff members chuckled. Some rolled their eyes. A few nodded like they'd heard this kind of thing before. I felt ridiculous. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was some logical explanation I wasn't thinking of. A power surge? A problem with the batteries? Some kind of electromagnetic interference? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, I stayed late to finish up some paperwork. The students had gone home, and most of the staff had left, but the teacher and a few others were still around in different classrooms. The hallways were silent, the whole unit eerily still. As I worked, I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft thud, then another. Then a dragging sound, like something heavy shifting across the floor. I stopped writing and listened. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the classroom. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty. I stayed still, straining my ears. After a few seconds, I heard it again, another dull thud, followed by the dragging noise. It wasn't coming from another classroom. It sounded like it was right there, just beyond the door. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was long and dim, the old fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. The air felt unnaturally still. I looked both ways, trying to make sense of what I had heard. Then another sound. This time, from inside the classroom. I turned back, scanning the room. Everything looked the same, but something felt off. My skin prickled. The desks, the chairs, the whiteboard, it was all as it should be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved when I wasn't looking. I shut my laptop, grabbed my bag, and left without finishing my work. The incidents kept piling up, doors creaking open on their own, papers shifting on my desk when no one was near them, the occasional feeling of being watched when I was alone in the room. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the whiteboard had a glitch, that the toys had bad wiring, that the sounds were just the old building settling. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, after another round of the whiteboard turning itself on while we were outside, I made up my mind. I walked to the principal's office and put in my resignation. 2 weeks later, I left the special needs unit for good. As I walked out of the old wing for the last time, I glanced back at the classroom one last time. The whiteboard was dark. The toys were silent. The room was empty. But I still felt like something was watching me. And I never went back. I still don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's because I don't sleep much anymore, and when I do, I wake up gasping for air, my skin damp with sweat, my heart racing like I've just been running. Maybe it's because I still see her eyes, staring, unblinking, locked in that grotesque expression of artificial life. Or maybe it's because, after all this time, I need to tell someone what I saw, what I learned. Even now, I wish I hadn't been a part of it. Back then, I was a detective in a mid-sized Canadian city. Not some high-ranking officer, not a specialist in violent crimes, just a guy who worked long hours and tried to keep his head above water in a job that dragged you into the depths every single day. I'd seen bad things. Stabbings over pocket change. Husbands strangling wives in fits of rage. People who went to bed after an argument and woke up to find their loved ones cold and stiff beside them. I thought I understood what humans were capable of. I was wrong. She was only 18. A kid, really. Her name was Samantha. She worked nights at a small roadside coffee kiosk, one of those places where you pulled up in your car, placed your order through a window, and a tired teenager in an apron handed you a steaming cup of caffeine to keep you awake for the long drive ahead. It wasn't a great job, but it paid. It was late January when she vanished. The kind of winter night where the cold settles into your bones, where the wind cuts through every layer of clothing like you're wearing nothing at all. The kind of night where you don't want to be outside, especially not alone. The surveillance footage was grainy, black and white. It showed a man walking up to the kiosk just after closing time. No mask, no hesitation. He slid through the window with practiced ease, moving like a man who'd done this before. Then she was gone. No signs of a struggle. No frantic calls for help. Just a girl, finishing up her shift 1 second and vanishing into the night the next. Her parents reported her missing the next morning when she didn't come home. At first, we thought she might have run off. Kids did that sometimes. Maybe she had a boyfriend nobody knew about. Maybe she just wanted to get away. But then her bank account started bleeding money. It was slow at first. Small withdrawals from ATMs spread across different cities. Someone was using her debit card. Someone was moving. Then, 2 weeks later, her parents got a letter. I saw it when it came in, spread out on the desk in front of me like a bad joke. A ransom note. $30,000, where they'd never see their daughter again. $30,000 wasn't a lot for a ransom demand. That was the first thing that bothered me. Kidnappers usually wanted more. If it was a scam, why such a specific amount? Her parents asked for proof of life. If their daughter was still alive, they wanted to see her. The reply came fast. A photograph. She was sitting in a chair, her expression flat, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. Her eyes were open, staring directly at the camera. A newspaper rested in her lap, the date visible. That was all they needed. Her parents pulled together the money, draining savings, borrowing what they had to. We watched every transaction, hoping to catch whoever was behind it. But deep down, something didn't sit right. I looked at that picture too many times. Something about it felt off. Her eyes were wide, too wide. The skin beneath them looked strange, almost swollen. Her posture was rigid, unnatural. I told myself it was trauma, that she'd been through hell, that maybe she was drugged, that maybe she was being forced to sit there. I told myself a lot of things. We tracked the card as best we could. The withdrawals came from different locations, spanning across Canada, and the US whoever was behind it was moving fast, taking only what they needed. At first, they were careful. Different ATMs, different times of day. But eventually a pattern emerged. A white car. Nothing fancy. Just an ordinary, forgettable sedan. But it showed up in surveillance footage too many times to be a coincidence. When the suspect crossed back into the US, the FBI got involved. That was when things started unraveling. They got him at a gas station, alone, tired looking. At first, he didn't seem concerned. He had an easy smile, a calm demeanor. Then they found her card in his wallet. And that was it. Case closed. Or so we thought. When the interrogation started, we thought we had time. We thought we could make a deal. Find the girl, bring her home. But then he spoke. His name was Israel Keys. And he was nothing like anyone I had ever encountered before. He talked about her in past tense. She's been dead this whole time, he said, his voice casual, detached. Like he was talking about the weather. She had never been held for ransom. She had never been waiting for her parents to save her. She had been dead since the night she was taken. The truth was worse than anything I had imagined. After abducting her, he took her to a small garage, just outside the house where his girlfriend and young child were sleeping. He killed her there. No ceremony. No hesitation. He had done this before. Then, he left her body in the cold. Midwinter in Canada is brutal. The kind of cold that burns your skin, that locks everything in place. The kind of cold that preserves. And when the time came to send the ransom note, he pulled her from where she had been resting, frozen, untouched. He positioned her carefully. He propped her up. And then, using a needle and thread, he sewed her eyes open. The photo her parents had received, the proof of life they had so desperately hoped for, it was a lie. She had been dead for weeks. I didn't sleep for days after that. Maybe weeks. I kept thinking about the photo, the way her face looked, the way her eyes stared out, seeing nothing. Her parents never saw the unedited version. They never saw what he had done to make her look alive. I wish I hadn't either. Israel Keys wasn't like other killers. There was no pattern, no preference. He didn't care about race, gender, age. He took people when it was convenient, when the opportunity was right. We would never know how many. He had kill kits buried across the country, tubs filled with weapons, restraints, cash IDs. He planned his crimes years in advance. And he wasn't done. When he was finally caught, he hinted at other victims. Names we would never know, bodies we would never find. He was a predator in the purest form. One day, he took a razor blade from a disposable razor and ended his own life in his cell. No final words. No remorse. Just silence. It should have been a victory. But it wasn't, because there were still questions. Still victims we would never identify. Still families who would never have answers. I left the force not long after. There are things you can't unsee. Things you carry with you, no matter how much time passes. I still think about that picture. I still see those eyes. Frozen. Unblinking. And I wonder how many others are still out there, waiting to be found. Hawaii was supposed to be paradise. That's what everyone called it. That's what I thought too, at least at first. I was about 7 when my family took a trip there, the first real vacation I can remember. My parents, my 2 sisters, and I packed into a rental car, ready to explore the island. I don't remember which island it was, maybe Kauai, maybe somewhere else. All I knew was that it was green, covered in mountains and thick jungle, and that it was hot. Even standing in the shade made me sweat. My parents weren't the type to stick to beaches or tourist spots. They liked finding hidden gems, things that weren't in travel brochures. That's how we ended up talking to some locals one day, probably at a gas station or some roadside stand. I don't really remember. What I do remember is them mentioning an old irrigation canal, one that ran through the jungle, sometimes underground, sometimes in the open. Supposedly, they went tubing through it all the time. My parents loved the idea. It was free. It was different. It wasn't crowded. They were sold on it immediately. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. Not that it seemed important at the time. It wasn't like we were going hiking into the wilderness. We were just going tubing down a man-made canal. It sounded safe enough. My parents didn't seem worried, and at that age, I assumed they always knew what they were doing. We bought cheap inner tubes from a dollar store and piled back into the car. The drive took forever, long stretches of gravel roads winding through what felt like the middle of nowhere. I watched out the window as the jungle thickened, the trees towering over us, vines hanging so low they almost brushed the car. The road was rough, every bump shaking my seatbelt against my chest, every dip making my stomach flip. Then finally we found it. The canal ran alongside the road, a narrow strip of rushing water. I could hear it before I saw it, the sound of moving water strong and steady, like a river forced into a straight line. On either side of the road, tunnels cut through the earth, some completely enclosed, others open to the sky. The entrances were dark, gaping holes in the rock, looking more like caves than anything man-made. My dad wanted to test it first. He tossed an empty tube into the first tunnel, and we watched as the current carried it inside. Seconds passed. Then it shot out the other side, spinning lazily in the open-air section of the canal before floating further down. That was all the proof we needed. If the tube made it, so could we. I was excited at first. It seemed fun, floating down a river, letting the water carry us. No paddling, no effort, just drifting. I climbed onto my inner tube, the rubber warm from the sun, and pushed off from the edge. The water was shockingly cold, but I didn't care. The current pulled me forward, and for a few moments, it was actually kind of peaceful. The first tunnel was easy. It swallowed us in darkness for a few seconds, but I could see the light at the other end, the bright opening framed by jungle. The tunnel walls were smooth, the ceiling high above our heads. The water moved fast, but nothing felt dangerous. When we popped out the other side, I was grinning. Then we realized we couldn't get out. The current was too strong. There weren't any banks, no way to climb out. The canal was built to keep water moving, which meant no slow spots, no calm sections to stop. My dad tried paddling toward the edge, but the water just carried him further. We weren't in control anymore. We were going into the second tunnel, whether we wanted to or not. This one was different. It was longer, much longer. The entrance swallowed us in pitch blackness, and I felt the first stab of fear in my stomach. There was no light ahead, nothing but pure darkness stretching in front of us. I tried to focus on the feeling of the tube under me, the way it kept me floating, but my hands clenched the rubber so tight my fingers hurt. Seconds passed, then a minute. The darkness felt endless. Then the ceiling got lower. At first, it was just a feeling, a brush of rough stone against my hair. Then it was more than that. The walls were tightening, the air getting thinner, the water rushing faster. I felt something scrape against my shoulder, a sharp sting, and I realized the space was shrinking. I had to duck. I pressed my chin to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. My sisters were just ahead of me, and I could hear them splashing, struggling to stay on their tubes. Then I heard it, a loud pop. My mom's tube had burst. The sound was quick, almost lost in the rush of water, but then she was screaming. Not loud, not panicked, just a short, sharp sound as the current yanked her under. I couldn't see her, but I could hear the splashing, hear the way she fought against the water. Then my sister's tube popped. Then mine. I went under. The water grabbed me, pulling me forward, dragging me over rocks. I kicked, struggling to stay afloat, but the current was too strong. The tunnel was too narrow, the walls scraping against my arms and legs. My foot hit something below, roots, thick and knotted, twisting through the water like fingers reaching for me. I yanked my leg up, trying not to think about what would happen if I got stuck. The ceiling kept getting lower. I flipped onto my back, desperate for air, but my nose scraped against the rock above me. It was too low, too close. I reached up, touching the ceiling, feeling the rough stone just inches above my face. There was no room. The tunnel pressed around me. The water was deafening. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know how much longer it would last. It felt like forever. The panic built in my chest, my lungs burning, my fingers scraping against the walls as I fought to stay above the surface. Every second stretched impossibly long. I didn't know if the tunnel would ever end, if the ceiling would keep dropping until there was no air left, if I would just. Then my dad screamed, "I see the end." His voice cut through the chaos, breaking through the rush of water, the silence of the tunnel. I forced my head up, barely managing to keep my mouth above the surface, and I saw it. A light, faint at first, then brighter. The tunnel was opening. The walls pulled away, the ceiling lifted, and suddenly we were free. The current spat us out into the open air, tossing us into a wide, shallow pool. I hit the bottom hard, my hands scraping against rocks, but I didn't care. I pushed myself up, gasping, coughing, choking on air. My sisters were there, my mom, my dad. We were all shaking, soaking wet, covered in scrapes and bruises. No one spoke. We just lay there, staring up at the sky, the bright blue so sharp it almost hurt to look at. My body felt heavy, my arms trembling, my legs weak. We never talked about going back. We never talked about trying again. We got up, limped back to the car, and drove away. To this day, I don't do caves. I'd never really feared for my life before that night. I'd been in situations that startled me, sure, close calls in traffic, moments of panic in unfamiliar places, but nothing that made me think, this is it. This is how it ends. Asterisk, asterisk. But that night in the Texas desert, I felt it. That slow, creeping terror that tightens in your chest before it explodes into full-blown panic. The feeling of knowing you're helpless, that someone else is in control of your fate, and that they might not be the kind of person to let you walk away. We were about 3 hours east of El Paso, deep in one of those strange little towns that feel more like a memory than a place. The kind that barely exists on a map, with a single gas station, a couple of old buildings, and more abandoned structures than occupied ones. The only reason anyone even passed through was because some famous artist had worked there decades ago, and now it had become a quiet destination for the kind of people who liked forgotten places. The roads stretched endlessly through nothing. No streetlights, no signs, no landmarks except for the occasional rusted-out car husk or collapsing barn. At night, it felt like the whole world had been swallowed up by the dark. We had been driving back from an aimless exploration outside of town, just me, my boyfriend, and my friend. I was at the wheel, my boyfriend in the passenger seat, my friend in the back. The rental car was a cheap little sedan with Florida plates, the kind of car that screamed, "We don't belong here." We'd gotten lost. The GPS wasn't cooperating, and I was fumbling with my phone, trying to find our location on the screen while rolling forward at barely 2 miles per hour. The road was nothing but packed dirt, uneven and scattered with loose gravel, the kind that made the tires shift slightly with every little acceleration. The silence outside was absolute. No wind, no distant engine hum, no life at all. And then, a scream from the back seat. I jolted, my head snapping up as my hands clenched the wheel. My friend had practically thrown herself forward between the seats, her breath ragged and fast. And I saw it, a bright, searing beam of light cutting through the back window. A flashlight, not from a car, not from a house, from someone standing right there, just outside the vehicle. Before I could even react, before I could even form a thought beyond confusion, my eyes followed the light. And there he was, not 10 feet in front of the car, just slightly to the right. A man stood facing us. Ski mask, black bandana over his face, and a shotgun in his hands. I could see the barrel, heavy, slightly tilted downward but unmistakable. He wasn't holding it casually. He wasn't some guy out for a hunt. He had stepped into our path, fully masked, fully armed, in the middle of nowhere. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers clenched so hard around the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. I don't even remember making the decision. I floored it. The engine roared in the silence. The tires skidded, struggling for traction on the loose dirt. The car lurched, and for a split second, I thought we were going to spin out, that I had just made the worst mistake possible. But then we surged forward, kicking up dust behind us. I ducked low over the wheel. My boyfriend was already down, his hands braced against the dashboard. My friend had nearly crumpled into the back seat, her arms over her head. I expected a shot. Expected the deafening blast of gunfire, the shattering of glass, the punch of something hitting me before I even had time to process the pain. But nothing came. I didn't dare look back. I kept my foot pinned to the pedal, the car jerking with every bump in the road. My pulse hammered in my ears, my body locked in pure survival mode. The road twisted, and I nearly lost control trying to take the turn too fast. I didn't care. I couldn't slow down. My entire body screamed at me to keep going. I don't know how long I drove like that. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. Only when I saw the faintest glow of distant lights, civilization, safety, something, did I let myself breathe. I didn't stop. Didn't pull over. Not until we were back in town, parked under the fluorescent glow of a gas station. The three of us sat there, panting, shaking, staring at each other with wide, unblinking eyes. No one said a word. I called 911. The operator listened. I told them everything, the masked man, the shotgun, the flashlight. The fact that we had been in the middle of nowhere with no possible reason for someone to be standing in the dark like that. And their response, they were probably just hunting, in the middle of a road, in full face covering, with a flashlight shining directly into the back of a stranger's car. I wanted to argue, wanted to scream that no hunter does that no normal person stands silently in the middle of the night aiming a gun at a rental car. But what was the point? The call ended. We checked the car, half expecting bullet holes, but there were none. We got a motel room. We locked every door. We pushed furniture against the entry. None of us slept. Morning came slow. When we finally ventured outside, the world felt unsettlingly normal. The sun was bright, the town just as quiet and strange as before. We left as soon as we could. Even now, I don't know what would have happened if I had hesitated, if I had stopped, if I had rolled down the window, if I had let that moment stretch just a little longer. I try not to think about it, but I do. I first met Joe 3 years ago. Back then, he was the kind of man everyone liked. One of those people who lit up a room just by being in it. He was 6'2", built like he had spent a lifetime on his feet, which he pretty much had. A retired principal, a basketball coach, a father, a grandfather. Even in his late 60s, he was in better shape than most men half his age. Every morning, rain or shine, he ran 3 miles. He had this laugh, this deep, rolling chuckle that made you want to laugh too, even if you didn't know what the joke was. He always had a story to tell, usually about his days coaching or something his grandkids had done. He was that guy, the one everyone knew, everyone loved. And then one day, everything changed. It started small, like these things always do. He came in and mentioned he had taken a fall over the weekend. Said he was fine, just a little shaken up. He went to the hospital, just to be safe, and they told him to take it easy. Nothing was broken, nothing seemed off. Just a fall, nothing more. But then a month later, he mentioned another fall. Then another, and another. At first, he laughed it off. Said he was just getting clumsy in his old age. But I could tell something was wrong. It was in the way he moved. Joe had always walked with confidence, with purpose. He was the kind of guy who stood tall, broad-shouldered, like a man who had spent his life leading people. But now there was something different. A hesitation in his step, a slight unsteadiness. He was slowing down. He didn't talk about it much at first. He was the kind of man who didn't like to complain, who had spent his life being the strong one. But then, after the 4th fall in just 2 months, his family started getting worried. They took him to doctors, specialists, ran every test they could think of, and they found nothing. 5 months of searching. 5 months of appointments, scans, blood tests. Nothing. Meanwhile, Joe kept getting worse. It wasn't just the falls anymore. His hands started shaking. He told me he was having trouble holding on to things, like his fingers weren't listening to him the way they used to. He started stumbling more, slurring his words just slightly, just enough to notice. Then one day, he walked in with a cane. I remember that moment so clearly. This was a man who had spent his entire life moving, running, coaching, leading. And now, he needed a cane just to stay upright. It hit me then, whatever this was, it wasn't going away. His family kept searching for answers, but the doctors just shrugged. No strokes, no tumors, no clear reason why his body was betraying him like this. And then, almost a year after his first fall, they figured it out. Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. There's something especially cruel about that disease. It doesn't just kill you, it traps you. Slowly, piece by piece, it steals everything. Your movement, your speech, your breath. Your mind stays sharp, trapped inside a body that refuses to work. Joe took it like he took everything, with quiet strength. He didn't break down, didn't cry, didn't complain. If he was scared, he didn't show it. But I could see it. It's in the little things, the moments people don't think anyone notices. The way his hands trembled just slightly when he held onto something. The way he clenched his jaw when he tried to take a step and his leg didn't quite respond. The way his eyes lingered on the runners passing by when he sat on a park bench, gripping his cane, watching them move the way he used to. The decline wasn't slow anymore. Within months, he went from a cane to a walker, then to a wheelchair. He stopped running, then stopped walking, then stopped moving much at all. His voice started going next. It was gradual at first. He'd start a sentence and have to pause, like his mouth couldn't quite keep up with his thoughts. Then the pauses got longer. Then some words just wouldn't come out at all. Eventually, he just stopped talking. I can't explain how much that hurt. Joe was a storyteller, a man who could talk to anyone, who could make you laugh with a single sentence, who always had something to say. And now he was silent. He still came in, but he didn't have to say anything. I could see it in his eyes. He knew. We all knew. By the time the next summer rolled around, he needed help with everything. He couldn't feed himself, couldn't dress himself. His wife, the woman who had been with him for 40 years, had become his full-time caretaker. His family took shifts, making sure he was never alone. But even then, the disease kept taking more. His muscles wasted away. His breathing got weaker. He could no longer hold himself up, even in a chair. I saw him for the last time in late fall. By then, he was barely there. His body, at least. His mind was still sharp, but his body was nothing more than a shell. He couldn't talk, couldn't move. His eyes still held something, though, some part of him that refused to be beaten down. I don't know if he knew it was the last time I'd see him. Maybe he did. I did. He didn't make it to Christmas. His family sent out a message, letting everyone know. He passed in his sleep, peacefully, surrounded by the people he loved. There's no way to make sense of something like that. No way to explain why a man who spent his life being strong, being active, being alive could be taken down so quickly, so brutally. Life isn't fair. But if there's one thing I hold on to, it's this. Joe didn't let it break him. Not really. Even when he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything for himself, he never lost himself. He was still Joe. And that's something no disease could ever take away. I never thought I would be the kind of person to freeze up in fear. I always assumed I would react quickly, do the right thing, maybe even fight back if I had to. But when I walked into my own home and realized I wasn't alone, all of that disappeared. I became something smaller, something helpless, something I had never felt before. And the worst part, I didn't even realize how much danger I was in until it was over. My partner and I were living in a tiny apartment at the time. Calling it an apartment was almost too generous. It was more of a converted storage space, barely big enough for the two of us. The kitchen, living area, and entrance were all one small room, and above that was a cramped loft where we had shoved a bed and a dresser. A ladder-like set of stairs led up to the sleeping area, and the only bathroom was tucked just beyond it. The whole place was designed to be functional, but not exactly comfortable. The worst part about the layout was the window in the bedroom. It was big, too big for a place that small. Someone had installed it ages ago, probably to make the loft feel less suffocating. But the problem was it could be accessed from the outside. It wasn't ground level, but it wasn't so high that someone determined couldn't reach it. I had joked before that all it would take was a ladder or some kind of prop to boost someone up, and they could climb in easily. At the time, it was just that, a joke, a passing thought. That afternoon, I left to pick up a few things from the corner store. It wasn't a planned trip, just something quick. I needed milk and some snacks, and since the store was right next to my building, I figured I'd be back in no time. I didn't lock the bedroom window when I left. I never did. We always kept it shut, but we never thought to lock it. The whole trip took maybe 15 minutes. I walked the same sidewalk I always did, grabbed my things, and even chatted with the cashier for a moment before heading back. Everything was normal. I didn't feel watched. I didn't notice anything unusual. But the second I stepped through my front door, I heard it. A rustling sound. Something moving upstairs in the loft. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had left in a hurry. Maybe I'd forgotten to close the window, and the wind had knocked something over. Or maybe my partner had come home early from work. That was my first real assumption, that he had come home without telling me. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I called out his name. The reply wasn't his voice. It wasn't even in English. A deep, unfamiliar voice responded to me, speaking in a language I didn't understand. That was the moment it hit me. Someone was in my house. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I felt my body seize up. My heart jumped so hard it felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. My hands went cold. My legs felt weak. I had never felt fear like that before. Not fear that was real. Fear that was in my own home. I don't even know what I screamed. I think I told him to get out, that I was calling the cops, that he had no right to be there. Maybe I just yelled nonsense. My voice felt distant, like I wasn't even the one speaking. I heard movement, the sound of blinds rattling, the creak of the window shifting, then silence. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. My brain felt stuck, unable to decide what to do next. Then, suddenly, I remembered my phone. I had left it on the bed upstairs. For some reason, that snapped me back to reality. I needed my phone. I needed to call the police. I needed to get help. My feet moved before I could even think. I sprinted up the stairs, nearly slipping as I reached the top. The bedroom was empty. The window was wide open, the blinds swaying slightly from the motion. I grabbed my phone and dialed with shaking hands. The dispatcher answered almost immediately, but I barely registered what they were saying. I forced the words out, trying to explain what had happened, but my mouth felt dry. My thoughts were jumbled. It was only when they asked me if I was in a safe place that I realized I didn't know. I had no idea if the man was still nearby, if he had truly left, if he was waiting outside, watching. The police arrived quickly, faster than I expected. By then, I had moved back downstairs, standing near the front door, ready to bolt if I had to. The officers checked the apartment first, clearing every space, but I already knew he was gone. They found the evidence, though. The window had been forced open from the outside. On the ground beneath it, they found an old bicycle propped against the wall, just the right height to be used as a stepping stool. That was when the realization hit me. He had been watching me. He had been waiting for me to leave. He must have known my routine, noticed how long I was usually gone. He had been prepared, and I had come back too soon. The police didn't give me much comfort. They told me they would patrol the area, that they'd keep an eye out, but there was no guarantee the guy wouldn't come back. They didn't even know who he was. No cameras, no clear description. Just a voice, a presence. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for a lot of nights after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing in my bedroom, rifling through my things. What had he been looking for? Money? Electronics? Or had he been after something else? I started double-checking the locks, then triple-checking, then quadruple-checking. Every time I left the house, I felt like someone was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. The worst part was knowing that he had gotten inside so easily, that my home, my space, wasn't as safe as I thought. We moved out a few months later. It wasn't just because of the break-in, but that was part of it. I couldn't stay there anymore. Every sound at night sent my heart racing. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Even now, years later, I still think about that day. About how close I came to something worse. About how lucky I was that he left when he did. And the scariest part? I'll never know what would have happened if I had come home just a few minutes later. College had been a mix of freedom and routine. Northern California was beautiful, and my house, an old rental shared with 3 other women, sat in a quiet neighborhood just a few blocks from campus. We weren't in the nicest part of town, but it was far from the worst. The kind of place where you felt safe most of the time, but you still locked your doors at night. It was a Saturday night, and my roommate and I had been drinking. Not a wild party, just the two of us at home, sipping cheap vodka mixed with whatever juice we had left in the fridge, talking about nothing, letting the buzz take over. At some point, I stretched out on the couch, comfortable and warm under the weight of alcohol, and let sleep pull me under. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to the doorbell. At first, I didn't register it as something real. My head felt thick, my body heavy. The sound pushed into my dreams before pulling me out of them completely. It wasn't the sharp, sudden chime of a single press. It was repetitive. The doorbell rang, stopped, then rang again. I groaned, turning onto my side, pressing my face into the couch cushion. My mouth was dry, and my head ached in that way it does when you've been drinking and then sleep too hard. It took me another few rings to really understand that someone was at the door, pressing the bell over and over. I sat up slowly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen, where we'd left the oven light on. Everything was still, the air in the house stale and quiet. I could hear my other roommate snoring faintly from her bedroom. I blinked at the front door, trying to wake myself up fully. The doorbell rang again. Annoyed now, I pulled myself off the couch, stumbling slightly, still a little drunk, still groggy. The floor felt cold under my bare feet as I shuffled toward the door. There was no peephole, just a small, rectangular window next to the door, covered by a thin curtain. I reached for it, moving it just enough to peek outside. My roommate was standing there, shifting from foot to foot, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was pale, eyes wide. I blinked at her, still sluggish, my brain working too slowly to process anything. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. She shoved past me, almost knocking me off balance, slamming the door shut behind her. That's when I saw him. Through the thin curtain, a figure moved. Just at the edge of the porch light's glow. A man, dressed in dark clothing, a hood pulled over his head. He stood just beyond where my roommate had been, half hidden in the shadows of our overgrown front yard. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs. The man hesitated for a second, then turned and ran. It wasn't fast at first. More of a casual jog, as if he wasn't in a hurry, as if he didn't need to be. Then, just before disappearing past the neighbor's fence, he sped up, his body disappearing into the dark. I stood there, staring after him, every hair on my body standing on end. Inside, my roommate was breathing hard, still clutching her arms, her whole body tense. I didn't know what to do. I turned the deadbolt and double-checked it. Then I did the same with the chain lock, pulling it tight. My hands were shaking. I went to the window again, this time moving the curtain just enough to scan the street. Nothing. The sidewalk was empty, the night still. But my heart wouldn't slow down. Slowly, I turned to face my roommate. She was shaking. Her face was damp with sweat. She looked like she wanted to collapse, but was forcing herself to stay upright. I looked at her, then back at the door, and something clicked. That man had been standing behind her. When I had hesitated, when I had taken my time getting off the couch, rubbing sleep from my eyes, stumbling toward the door, she had been outside, ringing the bell over and over, with him standing right behind her. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I locked the door again, pressing my palm flat against the wood, as if that would somehow make it stronger. My legs felt weak, and I suddenly wanted to throw up. She had been ringing the bell for what felt like forever, and I had just been lying there, half asleep, annoyed. I didn't know how long he had been following her. I didn't know how close he had gotten before she made it to the porch. I only knew that he had been there, that he had stood just behind her, close enough that I could still see the shape of his body in my mind, and that when I opened the door, when she ran inside, he hadn't chased after her. He had run the other way, as if he hadn't wanted me to see him, as if he had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble anymore. I sat down on the couch, my knees weak, my breath shallow. My roommate stood there for a long time, staring at the door, before finally sitting down next to me. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the silence outside, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, in the light of day, things felt different. The fear wasn't as sharp, but the unease remained, settling deep in my stomach. We talked about it over coffee, going over everything in careful detail, trying to make sense of it. We didn't call the police. Maybe we should have, but we didn't. What could we say? That a man in a hoodie had followed my roommate home? That he had stood outside our house for a few seconds before jogging away? We checked the news. There was nothing new about the guy on the loose. No updates. No arrests. Just the same warnings, the same reminders to be careful. Life went on. We went to class. We locked our doors. We didn't walk home alone. But that night stayed with me. Because I had almost left her outside longer. Because I had taken too long to get up. Because when I looked through that curtain, I had seen him, standing there watching. And because 10 years later, I still think about it. It was late, later than we probably should have been out. The streets had that empty, wind-blown feeling, like everyone had already gone home, leaving only the occasional passing car and the hum of streetlights. My friend and I had been out with a larger group, but we had split off, stopping at a local coffee shop before heading back. I don't remember what exactly we had been talking about when we first walked in, just idle conversation, something that felt completely unimportant afterward. What I do remember was the air in the shop, warm, slightly stale with the smell of coffee grounds, a faint trace of cinnamon, and something almost sour lingering under it all. The place wasn't busy. There was one employee behind the counter, wiping something down, and a couple of people seated at tables, absorbed in whatever they were doing. The kind of atmosphere where everyone was keeping to themselves. I needed to use the bathroom, but there was only one single-person restroom in the shop, and someone was already in there. The door was locked, the dull, metallic, occupied sign reflecting back at me when I checked. So I leaned against the wall to wait, shifting my weight from foot to foot, my friend standing nearby. That's when he walked up to us. A man, standing just a little too close, with a lopsided grin that I could already tell was going to be trouble. His breath smelled faintly of alcohol, not overpowering, but enough to tell that he had been drinking. He seemed friendly at first, a little off balance in the way he spoke and moved, but nothing that set off alarm bells. He was waiting too, apparently. Said he was here with a friend who was in the bathroom. Then came the questions. Are you two even old enough to be out this late? We laughed it off, brushed him off. Just another guy trying too hard, trying to find an excuse to start a conversation. But he didn't drop it. No, seriously, let me see your licenses. It was weird. We said no, obviously. Who asked something like that? He kept pushing, kept pressing, like he thought we were playing some kind of game with him. He even pulled out his own license, showing it to us like that meant something. Ray Rice. I saw the name clear as day. I wasn't paying attention to the address or the details, just the name, the way it stuck in my head because the whole situation felt strange. He wasn't aggressive. Not then. Just persistent, like he was used to people eventually humoring him. He kept looking at us, like he was sizing us up, and I remember shifting slightly closer to my friend, feeling the first prickles of unease. And then, finally, the bathroom door opened. I turned, relieved that my wait was finally over, only to see a man stumble out. Something about him wasn't right. His movements were slow, unsteady. He barely made it past the doorway before stopping, gripping the frame like he needed to hold himself up. He didn't leave, didn't move aside. Instead, he turned back toward the sink, bracing himself against it. He was drunk. That much was obvious. I hesitated. I really had to go, but for a second, I wasn't sure if I should. My friend was right outside, though. The coffee shop counter was right there. The guy could barely stand. If something happened, I could walk right out. So I went in. The bathroom smelled like cheap soap and that sharp, stale scent of alcohol. The seat was wet, speckled with something pinkish. I grabbed some toilet paper and wiped it off, hovering over it as I kept my eyes on the man. He didn't seem to care that I was there. He just stood at the sink, struggling to wash his hands. I could hear the water running, the weak splashing of it as he cupped his palms and let it run through his fingers. His reflection in the mirror was unfocused, distant, like he wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. At one point, he turned slightly and gave me a wobbly smile, but that was it. No words, no movement toward me. I finished up quickly and left. Outside, my friend was tense. She told me low and urgent that the license guy had been pushing harder while I was in the bathroom, asking again to see her ID, asking where we lived. He wasn't joking anymore. We both knew it was time to leave. We walked away quickly, heading back toward our group. We didn't talk much about it, just enough to say, that was weird, right? And agree that the guy had been acting way too pushy. But then, later that night, we found out what had happened. The drunk man, the one I had been alone with in that tiny bathroom, was dead. And the man who killed him? Ray Rice. The same man who had been trying to get our licenses, trying trying to figure out where we lived, sizing us up while we stood there clueless. The details came out in pieces. The two men had just met that night. It wasn't some long-standing grudge, no prior connection, just something that happened, senseless and quick. Rice later told the police he had an irresistible impulse to kill someone. Just like that. Like it didn't matter who. And for a long time after, that thought haunted me. Because if it hadn't been him, if it hadn't been that stumbling, drunken man who barely made it out of the bathroom before turning back to the sink, could it have been one of us? I thought about how persistent Rice had been, how he kept pushing, kept asking. I thought about the way he looked at us, the way he grinned, too wide, too eager. And I thought about the man in the bathroom, how I had watched him struggle with the faucet, barely able to stay upright, barely aware of his surroundings. How I had walked out without saying anything, without making sure he was okay. I could have stopped it. I could have told someone. I could have stayed. But I didn't. And that feeling never really left me. I don't remember the accident. I was too young. I don't remember the impact, the sound of metal crumpling, the way the world must have jolted as everything changed in an instant. But I do remember flashes of feeling, small fragments of something I could never piece together on my own. The warmth of my car seat beneath me, the smell of something burning, the muffled cries of my mother somewhere close, her voice frantic but distant, like I was floating somewhere between sleep and waking. Everything else, I know from the stories my mother and our family friend told me years later. And what they told me still makes my stomach twist. It happened in the early 2000s. We lived in a small town about 30 miles outside of a bigger city, a quiet place where everyone knew each other. My mom, my grandmother, and a family friend had taken a trip into the city for the day, probably for errands or shopping, something mundane. I had gone with them. I was only 2 or 3 years old, strapped securely in my car seat in the back. It was late afternoon when we were driving home. The sun hung low in the sky, stretching long shadows across the road. We must have been tired, ready to be home, to settle back into the comfort of familiarity. But we never made it. Somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Maybe it was another driver's mistake, maybe a miscalculation, maybe just bad luck, but the car was suddenly out of control. There was no time to react. The impact was violent, sudden, a force that tore through the quiet of the drive like an explosion. The world flipped, or maybe it only felt that way. When the car finally came to a stop, everything was chaos. Our family friend had been driving separately behind us. She saw everything, how the car spun, how it finally came to rest in a crumpled heap of metal and shattered glass. Somehow, miraculously, she had avoided the wreck herself, pulling to the side of the road as quickly as she could. She ran to us, heart pounding, breath coming too fast. Inside the car, my mother was in shock. I don't know if she felt the pain yet. Maybe adrenaline had dulled everything. Maybe her mind had shut down everything except one thought: me. She kept asking over and over, "Where's my baby? Is my baby okay?" She was barely aware of the paramedics who had arrived, their voices steady but urgent as they worked to get her and my grandmother out. In the confusion, in the noise and movement, no one noticed the other van at first. It had pulled over just after the crash, as if it had been following closely behind. Later, our family friend would say she thought it was someone stopping to help. Maybe another witness, another driver who had seen what happened and wanted to assist. But there was something off about it. It was white, older looking, with dark tinted windows. The kind of van that made you uneasy without knowing why. And then the door slid open. A woman stepped out. An old woman, small, white as snow, moving with unsettling urgency. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around in confusion like a bystander might. She went straight for the back seat. Straight for me. The car door was open, or maybe she opened it herself. Either way, she reached in, hands going for the straps of my car seat. She moved with quick, practiced motions, as if this wasn't the first time she had done something like this. As if she had planned for this exact moment. I don't know if I reacted. Maybe I was too dazed from the crash, too young to understand what was happening. Maybe I was crying, or maybe I was just silent, staring up at this stranger with wide, unfocused eyes. My grandmother was already in the ambulance by then. My mother was still being tended to by the paramedics, barely able to move, still demanding to see me. No one saw what was happening. No one except our family friend. She was already running toward the wreck, heart pounding. thinking only about making sure we were okay. And then she saw the woman, saw her hands gripping my car seat, working to free me. Something snapped inside her. She didn't think, just reacted. She ran faster, shouting, her voice cutting through the noise. She screamed at the woman, telling her to get away, telling the paramedics that this wasn't family, that she had no reason to be there, that she was a stranger. The woman froze, just for a second, just long enough for the paramedics to look up, to register what was happening, just long enough to realize that she had been caught. Then, without a word, she let go. She turned and ran back to her van, moving faster than anyone expected. The sliding door was still open, revealing a glimpse inside. A glimpse of something that would stay with our family friend for the rest of her life. There were other children in the back, different races, different ages, all silent, and then the door slammed shut. The van roared to life, and before anyone could react, before anyone could fully process what had almost happened, it was gone. No one got the license plate. No one was fast enough to stop it. By the time the police were called, by the time reports were made, the van was long gone. It had disappeared into the vast stretch of road, blending into the countless other vehicles heading away from the city. And that was it. It was over as quickly as it had started. I don't remember any of it. Not the crash, not the woman, not how close I came to disappearing forever. But my mother remembers. Our family friend remembers. And even though time has blurred the details, even though the years have passed, that moment, those few seconds that could have changed everything, have never left them. Because if our family friend hadn't been there, if she had been just a few steps slower, if no one had noticed in time, I wouldn't be here. I would have been just another child in the back of that van. I live in Wally. It's not the kind of place you'd want to raise a family, but it's home. The streets are lined with pawn shops, cash loan stores, and corner stores where security guards watch you like a hawk the second you step in. Hookers linger near bus stops, eyes darting nervously as they wait for their next ride. Tweakers shuffle by, muttering to themselves, lost in their own world. I've seen it all, fights breaking out over nothing, people slumped against buildings, passed out or worse. But you get used to it. Or at least you tell yourself that you do. That night, I was at the gym, my usual escape from the chaos outside. It was a 24-hour place, small and a bit rundown, but it had everything I needed. I'd been pushing myself hard, running on fumes after a long shift at work, but I wasn't ready to call it quits just yet. My muscles ached, tight and sore, and I knew I'd regret it in the morning if I didn't do something about it. The aqua massage bed was in the corner, tucked away in its own little space. It wasn't much, just a plastic-covered bed with jets of water pulsing underneath. It was loud, drowning out everything else, and for a few minutes, I let myself sink into the sensation, feeling the tension ease. Then, somewhere in the background, I thought I heard something. A scream. It was faint, muffled by the steady whooshing of the massage machine. I blinked, trying to focus, but exhaustion played tricks on me sometimes. Maybe I was imagining it. I closed my eyes again. When my session was over, I sat up, stretching. My head felt heavy, fogged over from lack of sleep. The gym was mostly empty now. A couple of guys were lifting weights, grunting with effort, but other than that, it was quiet. Too quiet. I rubbed my face and headed to the front desk to book a spot in the tanning room. The girl at the counter barely glanced up as she handed me the key. I'd done this 100 times before, the routine so familiar I could do it in my sleep. The tanning rooms were in a dimly lit hallway at the back of the gym. The air was warm, thick with the smell of sweat, lotion, and something else, something metallic. My stomach twisted slightly, but I ignored it. I've had epilepsy since I was a kid, and sometimes my senses played tricks on me. I was trained to ignore things like that, to keep moving and pretend everything was normal. I stepped into my usual room, locked the door behind me, and started undressing. The small space felt even warmer than usual, the air pressing in around me. My skin was damp with sweat, sticking to my clothes as I peeled them off. I was too tired to think, running on autopilot as I got ready for the tanning session. Then I opened the booth. I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain refused to process it. A girl was inside, or what was left of her. Her head and upper torso were completely split in half, her face frozen in a grotesque expression of pain and terror. Blood and tissue clung to the inside of the booth, dripping slowly, thick and dark. Her legs, just her legs, were on the floor, detached from the rest of her body, sprawled in a way that made my stomach lurch. The smell hit me then, thick and coppery. That metallic scent I'd been ignoring. My knees buckled, and I staggered backward, slamming into the wall. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tightening. My vision blurred at the edges, dark spots creeping in. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Seconds stretched into eternity. My body screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen in place, my mind looping through the same thoughts over and over. This isn't real. This can't be real. Wake up. But it was real. My stomach twisted violently, and I barely managed to stumble away before I vomited onto the tile floor. The sound snapped me back into reality, my senses flooding in all at once. The buzzing of the tanning booth, the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant clank of weights being dropped in the gym beyond the hallway. I needed to get out. I needed to tell someone. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat, and nearly tripped over my own feet as I stumbled into the hallway. The gym was still eerily quiet. No screaming, no sirens. Nothing. Had no one else seen this? Had no one else heard? I forced myself forward, the world around me tilting as I moved. My head was spinning, my ears ringing. I barely registered the faces of the people at the front desk as I shoved past them, out into the night air. The street outside was just as it always was. Cars rumbled by, neon lights flickered in dirty windows. A couple of junkies argued on the sidewalk. The city didn't care what I had just seen. It kept moving, indifferent. I don't remember the walk home. I don't remember how I made it up the stairs to my apartment, how I locked the door behind me. But I do remember sitting on the floor of my bathroom, shaking so hard I thought I was going to break apart. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The news barely covered it. Suspicious death at local gym. That was it. No details, no follow-up. Just another tragedy in a place where bad things happened every day. The police never said much. Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe they just knew that in Wally, people don't ask too many questions. 5 years have passed, and I still see her face. The way her mouth was frozen mid-scream. The way her body wasn't whole. I still smell it sometimes, that metallic tang of blood that lingers in the back of my throat no matter how hard I try to forget. I think about what I could have done. If I had paid attention, if I had listened, if I had gotten up from that massage bed when I thought I heard that scream. Maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe I could have saved her. But I didn't. And now, she's just another nameless victim in a city that doesn't stop moving. And I have to live with that. I was 14 years old when I came the closest I ever have to death. It wasn't some dramatic accident, not a near miss on the road, or an attack by a wild animal. It wasn't even something that most people would think of as a serious threat. But to this day, the memory of it haunts me in a way that nothing else ever has. It was summer, and not just any summer, but the kind of summer where the air feels thick and heavy, where even the shade gives no relief, and where the sun is so relentless that the ground itself radiates heat like a furnace. The temperature had climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, and every breath felt like it was being sucked through a layer of fire. That afternoon, I was at my best friend's house. We were playing, running around without a care, the way kids do when they have nothing but time. His house had a storage room, a small, dark space used only for keeping rice. It wasn't really a proper room, just a cramped space with walls that seemed to close in on themselves. No fan, no window, nothing to let in air or light. It was made purely for storage, not for people. The rice bags inside were stacked high, massive sacks that nearly touched the ceiling. They took up most of the space, leaving only narrow gaps between them, and the air inside was stale and thick with the scent of dry grain. I had never spent more than a few seconds in there before, because it was so suffocating. But that day, while playing around, my friend and I ran inside. It wasn't for any particular reason, just the kind of mindless, playful movement that kids make when they're chasing each other or running just for the sake of it. I stepped inside first, and before I even had a chance to turn around, the door swung shut behind me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't a big deal. But when I turned the handle, nothing happened. I twisted it harder. It wouldn't move. The door was locked. Even then, I wasn't panicked. I thought it was just stuck, or that my friend was messing with me. I knocked on the door, then pounded. "Open it!" I called out. I could hear him on the other side. I heard him try the handle, pushing and pulling, but it didn't budge. He tried again, and again. I was still standing near the door at that point, but the heat inside was already pressing against me. There was no movement of air, no breeze, nothing. The only thing I could feel was the oppressive, suffocating warmth closing in from all sides. My friend kept trying, but nothing worked. I could hear the frustration in his movements, the way he was yanking at the handle. Then he stopped. He didn't say anything. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his hesitation. And then, without another sound, he ran. I didn't understand what was happening at first. My brain refused to believe it. But when I pressed my ear against the door, all I heard was silence. He was gone. The realization hit me all at once. He had left me there. He had run away. He was too scared to tell anyone because he thought he would get in trouble. He left me behind to deal with it alone. Panic clawed at my chest. I banged my fists against the door, again and again. Help! Nothing. I screamed louder, my voice breaking. Somebody help me. The heat was unbearable. The rice bags around me seemed to absorb and radiate warmth, turning the room into an oven. Sweat poured down my face, soaking my shirt, making my skin feel sticky and heavy. My breathing was getting harder, not because I was panicking, though I was, but because there was barely any oxygen in the room. The air was thick and unmoving, and I could feel my lungs straining for relief. I turned toward the door, running my hands over the surface, searching for anything. Any crack, any weakness, any way out. That's when I found it. A hole. It was tiny, barely the width of my finger, low on the door near the floor. I pressed my face against it and sucked in air. It wasn't much, but it was something. I gulped at it desperately, the way someone dying of thirst would drink from a leaking faucet. But I couldn't stay like that forever. My legs were shaking, my heart was hammering in my chest. My hands were trembling, and it was getting harder to focus. I was drenched in sweat, my clothes sticking to me, my head spinning. I thought I was going to die. I didn't want to, but the thought lodged itself deep into my mind. There was no air, no way out. No one knew where I was. I didn't want to die like this. I started screaming again. I wasn't even forming words anymore, just raw, desperate noise, anything that might reach someone, anyone. My throat burned, my voice cracked, but I kept going. And then, a sound. Footsteps. I didn't know who it was. I didn't care. I screamed again, my last bit of strength forcing its way out of my lungs. The footsteps broke into a run. A voice. More voices. My mother's voice. The lock clicked. The door swung open. The rush of air hit me like a wave, but I didn't even get a chance to feel relief before my body gave out. My legs crumpled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the floor. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. The world felt distant, my body heavy and weak. My mother was there. The doctor was speaking, but it took a while before the words made sense. Another 5 minutes, and he wouldn't have made it. It didn't fully hit me until later. 5 more minutes. That was all I had left. I never found out why my neighbor came home that day. He had been out of town for 2 weeks. No one expected him back that day, and yet somehow he arrived at exactly the right moment. He was the one who heard me. He was the one who ran to get my mother. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if he had come back just a little later. If he had stopped somewhere on the way home, if he had gotten distracted. I wonder what it would have felt like, sitting there in the dark, the heat pressing down on me, my lungs giving up, knowing that no one was coming. I try not to think about it too much. I never went near that storage room again. Even years later, I can't stand tight spaces, and I hate the heat. Whenever summer rolls around and the temperature starts climbing past 40 degrees, I feel it creeping up my skin. The memory of the rice room, the weight of the air, the panic settling into my bones. I survived, but a part of me never left that room. I grew up in a place where not much happened, at least not much that mattered. The kind of town where nothing changed, where everybody knew everybody, and where the biggest excitement was a fight at the gas station or the occasional deer crashing through someone's windshield. It was a place where kids with too much energy and nowhere to put it found their own ways to kill time. Some drank, some fished, some ran wild through the Walmart parking lot like it was a damn amusement park. And some, like those two boys, liked to drive too fast down the long, empty roads. We all knew that stretch of road. It ran for miles without much on it, just farmland, the occasional rusting mailbox, and a few battered billboards that hadn't been changed in years. It was one of those roads that made people reckless. Something about the long blacktop, stretching straight out into the dark, just begged people to push the speedometer higher. It was a place with a history, too. You could still see the scars if you looked close, tire marks, shattered glass glittering in the dirt, chunks of plastic and metal that nobody had bothered to clean up. The wrecks all looked the same. Too fast, too dark, too late. I wasn't there that night. I didn't see the crash. But I heard about it. Everybody heard about it. In a town that small, a tragedy like that wasn't just something you saw on the news. It was in the air, in the halls of the school, in the way people stopped talking when certain names came up. It stuck to everything. The girls were well-liked. I wouldn't say I was close to them, but everybody knew them. They were the kind of girls that didn't have enemies, sweet, smart, the kind of pretty that never went to their heads. They were on the dance team, always winning medals, always the ones at the front of the routines. And they were the ones who died screaming in that burning car while their so-called friends ran. The boys didn't have much to say after it happened. They went back to school, sat in the same classrooms, walked the same halls. Some people whispered about them. Others pretended they didn't exist. But no one really did anything. No charges were filed. No one came for them. They just kept on living. But everybody knew. Everybody knew that when that car hit the tree, when the hood crumpled like a soda can and the flames started licking at the seats, they had a choice. And they chose to run. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. Tried to picture it in my head, though I don't want to. I imagine the sound first, the shriek of metal, the snap of tree branches, the thud of bodies thrown forward against seat belts. And then the silence, just for a second, before the fire took hold. I imagine the girls waking up to the smell of gas, to the heat pressing in, to the flickering orange glow swallowing the world outside the windshield. They were screaming. We know that much. Someone heard them. Someone driving down that road minutes later. A person who actually stopped. But by then, it was too late. I imagine the boys stumbling out, coughing, panicked. Looking back at the wreckage, at the flames eating through the dashboard, at the hands clawing at the windows, and then turning away, running, vanishing into the dark. I wonder how far they got before they stopped hearing the screams. They didn't tell anybody. That's the part that gets me the most. They didn't run for help, didn't call 911, didn't bang on the doors of the nearest house. They just kept going like a couple of stray dogs slinking away from the scene of a crime. The cops said the girls could have gotten out, that if those boys had stayed, if they had tried, the girls might still be alive. That's the part that makes me sick. They could have lived. They could have had a chance. But instead, they spent their last moments alone in that car, choking on smoke, feeling their skin blister in the heat, waiting for someone to come save them. And no one did. After the crash, things changed. Not in any big, obvious way, but you could feel it. The school felt quieter. People looked at each other differently. The dance team kept going, but it wasn't the same. The girls' parents stopped showing up to events, and their houses stayed dark at night. I remember one of the moms walking through the grocery store, just staring at the shelves like she couldn't remember what she was supposed to be buying. The boys, they never talked about it, never said a word. People whispered about them, but no one confronted them, at least not in any way that mattered. They walked through life with that weight on their shoulders, but they kept walking. Eventually, they left town. I don't know where they went, and I don't really care. There's a little roadside memorial now, just past the bend where it happened. Crosses with their names, fake flowers stuck in the dirt, pictures that fade more every year. Sometimes, people stop to leave something, a stuffed animal, a note. Other times, you drive past, and it's just there. A reminder. The road is still the same. People still drive too fast. There have been other wrecks, other lives lost on that stretch of blacktop. But that one sticks with me. Maybe because I knew them. Maybe because they didn't have to die. Maybe because I can still hear the screams in my head, even though I wasn't there. I had been driving for hours, and the fatigue was starting to creep in. It was the kind of exhaustion that doesn't hit you all at once but settles in slowly, making the road ahead feel longer than it really is. I was somewhere deep in North Carolina, far from the highways, winding through back roads that cut through dense patches of woods. I hadn't planned for such a late drive, but things had come up, and now here I was, alone, moving through the darkness, the glow of my dashboard lights the only source of comfort. My headlights reached ahead, illuminating the narrow road in patches. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just the empty stretch of asphalt, bordered by trees that seemed to swallow everything beyond the road. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but there was something unsettling about being this isolated. Every now and then, I'd catch the outline of a house set far back from the road, barely visible except for the occasional porch light left on. But for the most part, it felt like I was the only person left awake in the world. Then I saw it, flashing hazard lights up ahead. A car was parked on the side of the road in front of a house, its emergency lights cutting through the dark in rhythmic bursts. I slowed down, feeling my heart rate pick up just a little. I wasn't sure why. This wasn't the first time I had come across a stranded driver, and I'd always believed in stopping to help when I could. Still, something about the way the car just sat there, alone in the night, made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way the road had been so empty leading up to this point, or maybe it was the creeping exhaustion messing with my instincts. But I pulled over anyway. I parked a few feet behind the car and turned off my engine, but I kept my lights on. The glow from my headlights stretched forward, cutting across the back of the car. It was an older model, a sedan, but in decent shape. The house it was parked in front of was dark, with no porch lights on, no signs that anyone inside had noticed the car. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was average height, maybe mid-30s, dressed in jeans and a dark hoodie. The moment he saw me, he raised a hand in a casual wave before walking toward me. I felt myself grip the steering wheel just a little tighter before forcing myself to relax. The guy didn't look distressed, just a little frustrated. As he got closer, I could see the tension in his face, the way he glanced back at his car before looking at me. He seemed normal enough. Still, something in my gut felt off. I shook it off and stepped out of my car, keeping my eyes on him as he spoke. He explained that his car had been making a strange noise and that he pulled over to check it out. I nodded, glancing at the vehicle. The engine wasn't running, but everything else seemed fine. No visible damage, no sign that it had broken down. It was just sitting there. I walked over to the passenger side of the car and told him to start it up. The engine turned over without hesitation, humming smoothly. I listened for anything unusual, but it sounded just fine. I looked back at him. He frowned and said maybe it was the tires. I moved along the side of the car, inspecting each one carefully. Nothing. The tires looked fine, no flats, no bulges, nothing that would suggest an issue. I told him as much, but he just stood there, rubbing his chin, acting like he was deep in thought. I suggested he roll the car forward a little, just in case something was rubbing against it weirdly. He nodded, got back in, and eased the car forward a few feet. Still nothing. I stood there, waiting for him to say something, but he just sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring straight ahead. Then he said maybe the noise was only audible from inside the car. I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't what he said that bothered me. It was the way he said it. Too casual, too rehearsed. He gestured for me to get in, and that's when I saw it. A child, sitting in the back seat. It was just a quick glance, but I caught it. Small frame, a car seat, barely visible in the dim glow of the car's interior lights. My mind started racing. Why hadn't he mentioned a kid before? Why was the kid so silent? Something was wrong. I forced myself to stay calm. I stepped back, glancing down at the car's tires again, as if I was still checking them. Then I told him to roll forward just a little more, just to be sure. For a second, he hesitated. And then, without another word, he slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement before it sped off down the road, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, I just stood there, my brain scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. Then I snapped out of it. I turned and ran back to my car, heart pounding as I fumbled with my keys. The second the engine roared to life, I threw it into reverse, whipping the car around before peeling off in the opposite direction. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see his headlights reappear behind me, but the road stayed empty. The further I got, the harder it became to breathe. What the hell just happened? I replayed everything in my head over and over. The way he hesitated, the way he'd asked me to get inside the car. The kid in the back seat, silent, unmoving. Was it even his kid? Had I just walked into something I wasn't supposed to see? I drove nonstop until I reached my destination, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. By the time I finally pulled into the driveway, I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man, about what could have happened if I had gotten in that car, about what did happen wherever he went after speeding off into the night. I never reported it. What would I even say? There was no crime, no evidence, just a bad feeling that had nearly turned into something worse. But after that night, I made a rule for myself. I don't stop for anyone unless the sun is out. And even then, I think twice. "1997 was an uneventful year for me. That's not a bad thing. Uneventful meant safe. Uneventful meant normal. I was in middle school, and like most kids my age, I spent my days cycling through class periods, dealing with homework, and trying to stay out of any unnecessary drama. I wasn't particularly popular, but I wasn't an outcast either. I existed somewhere in between, just another face in the crowd. There was one girl in my class that year who didn't even seem to exist in the crowd. Not really. I had seen her before, but I didn't notice her until that year. She had a way of being so quiet, so still, that she almost disappeared in plain sight. She never raised her hand, never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her voice was so soft it barely registered. I don't think she had friends. Not real ones, anyway. Some kids are easy targets. Middle schoolers don't need much of a reason to be cruel, and because she kept to herself, because she seemed fragile, they latched onto her. A whispered insult here, a giggle when she walked by. Sometimes, a bolder kid would make a snide remark just loud enough for her to hear. She never reacted. Not once. No tears, no anger, no sharp words back. Just silence. I hated it. I wasn't a fighter, wasn't the type to stand up and make speeches about how people should be kinder, but I hated seeing people treated unfairly. It made my skin crawl. It felt wrong. I didn't want to be a hero, but I also didn't want to be another kid who ignored it. So I started talking to her. It wasn't much. A few words here and there. A note passed in class. I could see she was surprised, but she responded. Her handwriting was small and neat, the kind that made me picture her sitting for hours perfecting it. Over time, we talked more. Not enough to call her a close friend, but enough that I got to know her better. She never hung out with anyone outside of school. She told me, in a vague way, that her parents didn't allow it. They didn't let her go anywhere but school and church. No after-school activities, no birthday parties, no sleepovers. No makeup, no trendy clothes, no music that wasn't religious. I had never met her parents, but from the way she spoke about them, they were strict. Strict was the word I used at the time. I didn't know another word for it. Looking back, I think I did know another word. I just didn't want to say it. One day, she missed school. Then another. Then another. I offered to bring her homework over. She shut that idea down immediately. Not just a simple no thanks, but a panicked no. No, I can't, she had said quickly. I remember feeling embarrassed, like I had overstepped. But mostly, I remember feeling uneasy. It was the first time I had seen her react to anything with emotion. And the emotion wasn't shyness. It was fear. Her house was on a main road in town, so I passed it often. It always stood out to me, but not for the reasons most houses did. It looked lifeless. The windows were always dark, like no one lived inside. The garage door never opened. I never saw anyone outside, no kids playing, no parents mowing the lawn or washing a car. It was just there, a shell of a house, sitting hollow and still among all the others. Then, one morning, everything changed. We walked into class like normal, laughing and talking, the way kids do. But something was off. Our teacher was waiting at the front of the room, her face serious in a way I had never seen before. Next to her stood the school counselor. The room quieted. Our teacher took a deep breath and told us that the girl, *she*, was gone. She had died. They didn't give details at first, just said it was a tragedy. But we were old enough to understand what they weren't saying. Rumors spread fast. She had hanged herself. She left a note. The note talked about her parents, about how she had no friends, about how she was trapped. No one had seen it coming. No one had heard it coming. And I had talked to her. I had known something was off. The school brought in counselors. They called each of us in, one by one, to talk. When it was my turn, I told them everything. The things she had said. The way she had reacted when I offered to bring her homework. The way she had talked about her parents, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a quiet acceptance that scared me more than anything else. And then it was over. The house didn't change. It stayed dark, stayed empty. No signs of life. Eventually, a for sale sign went up, but the house sat there for a long time. No one wanted it. I started going out of my way to avoid it. At first, it was unintentional. I'd realized too late that I had taken a longer route home, or that I had turned onto a different street when driving through town. But then it became a habit, a conscious decision, because every time I saw that house, I pictured her hanging. I pictured that dark, empty house swallowing her whole. I pictured the note she left, the words she wrote, and I wondered if I had done enough. If I had noticed sooner. If I had said something earlier. If she would still be here. The years passed, but the house never left me. Even when someone finally bought it, repainted it, made it into a home again, I couldn't unsee it. Because for me, it would always be the house with no light. And for her, it was the house she never escaped. I was maybe 6 or 7 the first time I met him. My mom, my brother, and I were traveling through some small town, one of the countless places we passed through when I was a kid, and we stayed with her friend and his wife for a night. I don't remember the name of the town, and even if I did, it would probably be different now. Places change. People do too. I don't remember how long they had been friends, but my mom always spoke highly of him. He was an activist like her, someone who believed in justice, in fairness, in making the world better. My mom had taken us to protests before, mostly ones I was too young to understand, but I remember walking beside her while people held signs, their voices raised. He had been there too, in those crowds, standing for something. That night, when we stayed with him and his wife, I remember feeling at home almost immediately. I was a shy kid, but there was something about him that made me feel safe. He was soft-spoken, gentle. His house was warm, filled with books and little things that had probably been collected over the years. Trinkets from travels, old photographs, notes tucked into the corners of shelves. I don't remember his wife as well, just that she was there, and that she smiled at us, that she was kind too. But the thing that stands out the most, the thing I never forgot, was the cereal. We never got sugary cereal at home. My mom was strict about it, always making us eat healthy stuff, plain oatmeal, whole wheat everything. But that night, when we sat down for breakfast the next morning, he brought out 2 boxes. The bright colors on the packaging caught my eye immediately. "For you too," he had said, smiling. It was such a small thing, but even at that age, I understood that he had gone out of his way for us. He had bought those cereals specifically because we were coming, even though we were only staying one night. He had thought of us. I remember eating bowl after bowl, stuffing my face with more sugar than I'd probably ever had in one sitting, giddy with it. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, that's the detail that really sticks with me. Not just because of what happened later, but because of how deliberate it was. How much care went into that small act of kindness. We left that morning, and I never saw him again. It was a year or 2 later when I found out he was dead. I remember coming into the room and seeing my mom crying. That wasn't something I saw often. She was strong, the kind of person who didn't let things shake her too easily. But she had her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking, and when I asked what was wrong, she wouldn't answer. At first, she just said that her friend had died. That was sad, but I was still young enough that death didn't seem real. It was just something that happened to people you didn't know. It felt far away, even when it was close. It took some prying, but eventually we got more details. He had died in a bear attack in the mountains, my mom said. Him and his wife. That was scary, sure, but in my mind, it was still something that happened to other people. It wasn't like I was ever going to run into a bear. I didn't think much about it after that. I was mostly just sad for my mom. Years passed. I grew up, moved on. The memory of that night at his house, the cereal, the warm glow of the kitchen, it all became one of those hazy childhood things, something that didn't really feel like it had happened to me anymore. And then much later, I found out the truth. I don't remember exactly how old I was when I learned what had really happened. I must have been in my late teens, maybe older. By then, I was old enough to understand the weight of things, to see the world for what it really was. My mom hadn't told us the truth back then because she hadn't wanted to scare us. She had been protecting us, and I guess I can't blame her for that. But when I finally learned what had actually happened, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. He hadn't been killed by a bear. He had killed someone, a woman, not his wife. He had set her cabin on fire. And then, when it was done, he had taken a knife and ended his own life. It didn't make sense. Not at first. It still doesn't, even now. I remember feeling numb when I first heard it, like my brain couldn't process it. It was like someone had told me the sky wasn't real, or that gravity had stopped working. It didn't fit with the person I remembered. The man who had bought us cereal, who had been so kind, who had fought for good things. I asked the same question that I imagine everyone who knew him must have asked. Why? There were rumors, theories. Maybe he had been having an affair with the woman. Maybe something had gone horribly wrong. Maybe he had snapped. Maybe he had been hiding something all along. No one knew for sure. What we did know was that he had left a note for his wife before he died. "I'm so sorry," wife's name. That was it. No explanation. No answers. Just an apology. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it. I think about it sometimes, more than I'd like to admit. I think about sitting in his kitchen, eating bowl after bowl of cereal, feeling happy and safe and welcome. And I think about the fire, the knife, the note. The two things don't belong in the same world, but somehow they are. I think about how a person can be one thing and then become something else. Or maybe he had always been both. Maybe we all are. That's what scares me the most. I grew up in a neighborhood where bad things happened often. Not the kind of bad things that made the news, just the usual crime that came with living in a rough area. Break-ins, stolen bikes, fights that left someone limping the next day, things getting snatched right out of people's hands. Sometimes worse. There were stories about people disappearing, girls getting hurt walking home, junkies turning up dead in alleyways. People got used to it. Nobody moved here expecting it to be safe. But the thing that happened to Peter changed everything. It was different. I knew Peter. We used to take swimming classes together. He was quiet, a little awkward, the kind of kid who kept to himself unless you talked to him first. He had cerebral palsy, which made it hard for him to walk, and when he talked, his words came out slower, sometimes a little slurred. But he was smart. He always tried to keep up, even when the rest of us were running around or messing around in the water. I never saw him complain, never saw him act like he was upset that he was different. He just kept going. When I heard he was murdered, I didn't understand it at first. Someone said they found his body in an abandoned flat, and I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe he got lost, maybe he fell. I told myself it had to be something like that. But it wasn't. The truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. It started with a text message. Peter got a message from a courier, at least that's what he thought. The message said they had a package for his brother. His brother had been arrested a few days before for selling drugs. Everyone knew he was dealing, but he wasn't some big-time gangster. Just another guy trying to make money off the streets. But he got caught, and that was that. Or at least, it should have been. Peter probably didn't think much of it. Someone had a package for his brother, and they wanted to meet up to hand it over. Maybe he was suspicious. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, he went. He never came back. 3 or 4 days later, the police got a tip. An anonymous call. They said there was a body in an abandoned flat. Nobody lived there, just another empty place that people broke into when they needed somewhere to hide or get high. The police went in, and that's where they found Peter. At first, all anyone knew was that it was bad. Nobody told us details right away. Just whispers. People saying he was tied up, that they had done things to him, that it wasn't just a murder, it was something else. Something worse. Then the details came out. There were 5 of them. 5 people who planned it. The so-called courier was one of them. The other 4 were waiting in the flat when Peter arrived. Their plan was to kidnap him. They thought they could use him to blackmail his brother, maybe even his parents. They wanted money, about $77,000. But the plan didn't work. They realized pretty quickly that nobody was going to pay that kind of money for Peter. His parents didn't have it. His brother couldn't do anything from jail. So they changed the plan. First, they tried robbing him. He had $5. That was it. Maybe that was what set them off. Maybe it was just frustration. But once it started, it didn't stop. They tied him up. They hit him. At first, it was just that. Just hitting. Maybe they thought they'd scare him, toughen him up, make him beg. But he didn't have anything to give them. So they kept going. They were high. Took something. Maybe pills, maybe meth. Maybe both. They called it a party. That's what one of them said later, after they were caught. That it was just a party. They burned him. With cigarettes at first. Then with something else. A lighter. Matches. They were laughing while they did it. Someone put music on. Loud. The neighbors didn't hear anything except the bass rattling the walls. They made fun of him. His legs, the way he talked. They took pictures with him like it was funny. Then they cut him. They started with his fingers. One of them used a knife, another used something else, a box cutter maybe. The police never said for sure. They cut off pieces of him, like he wasn't even a person. He was alive through all of it. It went on for hours. They all got caught. That's the only good thing that came out of it. One of them broke down and told everything. How they planned it, how it went wrong, how it turned into something else. They got sentenced, and they'll never walk free again. But that doesn't change what happened. People didn't talk about it much after the trials were over. They just tried to move on. But something changed after Peter died. It wasn't just another crime. It wasn't just another bad thing that happened in a bad neighborhood. It was something else. People started locking their doors more. Started watching who their kids talked to. The gangs still ran the streets. The drugs still flowed. But there was this feeling now, this weight in the air. Like everyone knew how bad things could really get. The city didn't get safer. Not really. But it changed. Because we all knew what people were capable of now. I remember that day so clearly, even though I wish I could forget it. It was supposed to be a normal day, just me and my friends hanging out at the mall, catching up, shopping, laughing, enjoying ourselves. It wasn't anything special, just a way to spend time together while they were visiting. I hadn't seen them in a while, so I wanted the day to be fun, something to look back on and smile about. I never expected it to turn into something I would look back on and shudder. It started out so normally. We met up in the late morning, grabbed some coffee from one of the little kiosks near the entrance, and then wandered from store to store, stopping wherever we felt like it. We weren't in a rush. We had no real plans, just enjoying each other's company, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. The mall was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. Just the usual weekend crowd, families with kids, teenagers running around, older couples walking hand in hand. It was familiar, safe. At some point, maybe 2 or 3 hours in, my friend said she needed to use the bathroom. None of us really had to go, but we all went with her anyway, like friends do. The bathrooms were at the far end of the mall, down a quieter hallway near the food court. We had passed them earlier in the day and barely noticed them. Just another part of the building we didn't need to think about. The hallway leading to the restrooms was noticeably quieter than the rest of the mall. There were no stores down there, just a couple of vending machines and a family lounge. The noise of the mall, music, chatter, the hum of people, faded as we walked down the hall. We stopped outside, leaning against the wall while our friend went in. We waited. At first, we didn't think anything of it. Bathrooms take time. Maybe she was fixing her makeup or scrolling on her phone. We weren't counting the minutes. We were just standing around talking, checking our own phones, glancing at people as they passed by. Then the door swung open. At first, I didn't process what I was looking at. It was my friend, but she wasn't walking. She wasn't even conscious. 2 girls, maybe in their late teens or early 20s, were carrying her. One had her under the arms, the other was holding her legs. She was completely limp between them, her head lolling to one side. I froze. For a moment, my brain couldn't catch up with what I was seeing. Then it hit me. Asterisk, asterisk, something was wrong. Asterisk, asterisk. I stepped forward. So did my other friends. There was this split second of confusion, of panic, of what the hell is going on. The 2 girls carrying her didn't look at us at first. They were walking fast, too fast, like they were in a hurry to get out of there. And then they saw us. We must have looked as shocked as we felt because the moment we spoke, demanding to know what was happening, they dropped her, just like that. As if they hadn't been carrying a human being, but something unimportant, something they didn't want anymore. She hit the ground with a dull, lifeless thud. And then they ran. I didn't even look at them as they bolted down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I was already on the ground, reaching for my friend. Her body was slack. Her face was pale. Her breathing was slow and uneven. She wasn't waking up. Panic surged through me like ice in my veins. My hands shook as I touched her face, her shoulders, trying to wake her up, but she barely reacted. My other friends were already pulling out their phones, calling for help. People started to gather around. A few bystanders had seen what happened and rushed over, asking questions we couldn't answer. I kept talking to her, saying her name over and over, hoping she'd open her eyes and tell me it was just a bad joke. But she didn't. She was barely there. The next few minutes felt like a blur. Mall security arrived first, then paramedics. They checked her vitals, shone a light in her eyes, spoke in clipped, serious tones. They asked us questions we didn't know how to answer. Asterisk, did she take anything? Asterisk. Asterisk, does she have any medical conditions? Asterisk. Asterisk, was she drinking? Asterisk. No. None of us knew what had happened. All we knew was that she went into the bathroom, and then two complete strangers tried to take her out like she was nothing more than luggage. The paramedics got her onto a stretcher. One of them said she had a weak pulse. Another said something about her pupils being unresponsive. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good. Then the police showed up. They asked us the same question security and the paramedics had. They wanted descriptions of the two girls, what they looked like, what they were wearing, which way they ran. My mind was a mess, but I forced myself to remember. One had dark hair, the other was blonde. One wore a hoodie, the other had a crossbody bag. They were young, maybe the same age as us, maybe a little older. They had looked normal. Normal. That was the part that scared me the most. The cops took statements. They said they would check security footage. They promised they would find out what happened. But I could tell, just from their faces, that they had seen things like this before. That realization made my stomach turn. By the time we got to the hospital, my friend was stable but still unconscious. The doctors ran tests, and eventually, we got the answer we already suspected, but didn't want to believe. Asterisk, asterisk, she had been drugged. Asterisk, asterisk. They never figured out what the exact substance was. Whatever it was, it had been enough to knock her out cold. Enough that two strangers thought they could carry her out of a public place without anyone stopping them. The police never caught the girls. The mall cameras had footage, but not enough to identify them. They were careful. No clear shots of their faces, no credit card transactions to trace, nothing. Just two random people who walked into a bathroom, drugged someone, and then vanished. My friend recovered. It took days for her body to fully flush the drug out of her system, but she was okay in the end. Physically, at least. None of us were really okay after that. Something about it changed us. We didn't go to that mall anymore. Some of my friends didn't go to any malls after that. The idea of a public bathroom, somewhere we had always taken for granted as just a normal, everyday part of life, became something terrifying. And the worst part, we never got an answer. We never found out why they did it. We never found out what they wanted. And that haunts me the most. I grew up in a place no one ever wanted to live. A tiny, beat-up trailer sitting alone in the middle of endless grapevines, miles from anything that mattered. The kind of place you end up in when you're too broke to afford anything better. The kind of place where the walls are thin enough to hear the rats scurrying at night, where the floor sags under your feet, and where the air inside always smells faintly of mildew no matter how many times you air it out. We lived there for years, and every day I hated it. The summers were brutal. The tin roof turned the inside into an oven, the air conditioning barely worked, and there was nothing to do but stare at the dusty fields outside. Winters weren't much better. Cold drafts cut through the flimsy walls, and rain leaked through spots in the ceiling, forming puddles on the floor. But the worst part wasn't the discomfort. It was the isolation. No neighbors except for a sweet old lady down the road. No stores nearby. No streetlights. Just rows and rows of grapevines stretching as far as the eye could see, swallowing the land in every direction. The silence out there was suffocating. At night, it felt like the world ended just beyond the dirt driveway, like nothing existed outside that little bubble of darkness. I moved out in 2012. Finally, when we left, I thought I'd never have to think about that place again. We packed up, drove off, and I let myself believe it was just another miserable chapter in my life that I could close forever. But I was wrong. A father and son moved in after us. I never met them, but I heard things. Everyone who lived in that trailer was dirt poor. There was no other reason to end up there. The only upside was the surprisingly fast internet. But that didn't make up for the fact that the place was barely livable. The new tenants must have been desperate. From what I heard, they didn't have much. No real job, no steady income. They got by however they could, selling what little they had to make ends meet. At some point, they sold their car to a group of guys from Stockton. And that's when everything went to hell. I don't know what exactly was wrong with the car, but whatever it was, the buyers weren't happy. Maybe it broke down. Maybe they found out it had been in a wreck. Maybe it was barely holding together in the first place. Whatever the case, they felt cheated. They weren't the kind of people to just let that go. Somehow, they tracked down the father and son. I don't know how. Maybe through paperwork, maybe through someone in town who knew where they lived. But they found them, and they came back. It was late when they arrived. My old neighbor, the kindest woman you'd ever meet, someone who baked cookies for kids and fed stray cats, heard them arguing. The voices carried through the night air, loud and angry, the kind of shouting that made your gut twist because you just knew something bad was about to happen. She didn't see everything. She couldn't from where she was, but she heard it. The fight escalated. Yelling turned to threats. Threats turned to violence. And then gunshots. She called the cops, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The father was dead. They found his body in a ditch not far from the trailer, dumped there like garbage. No one knew if he died instantly, or if he was left there to bleed out. Maybe he was still alive when they tossed him in, staring up at the night sky, knowing no one was coming to save him. The son, whoever he was never the same after that. He left not long after. Maybe he couldn't afford to stay. Maybe he just couldn't bear to. Either way, the trailer sat empty again, just like it had been before we moved in. Only now it was different. The place had always felt miserable, but now it felt wrong. Every time I passed by it, I felt it. That eerie, empty atmosphere. The overgrown grass swallowing the driveway, creeping up the sides of the trailer. The windows dark and hollow, like empty eye sockets. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like a place that didn't want to be lived in anymore. The silence around it was heavier than before. Not just empty, but watching. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't think the Father's spirit is haunting that place. But when something that violent happens somewhere, it leaves a mark. You can feel it. The last time I drove past, I slowed down without thinking, staring at the place through my window. For a moment, I imagined what it must have been like for him in those final moments. The fight, the fear, the way the cold night air must have felt as he lay there in that ditch, knowing he wasn't going to make it. I didn't stop. I never stop. I just keep driving, leaving that place behind me, because no one should live there anymore. I used to live in an RV park in Gautier, Mississippi. The park, named Santa Maria, was nestled along Martin Bluff Road, a modest community where everyone knew each other's names and routines. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hum of cicadas, creating a backdrop of southern tranquility. One humid August afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the gravel paths, I noticed a new family moving into a camper a few lots down from ours. The camper was an older model, its once bright paint now faded and peeling. A boy about my age was helping unload boxes. His hair was a tousled mess, and his clothes hung loosely on his slender frame. He moved with a quiet efficiency, eyes downcast, avoiding the curious glances from neighboring residents. The next morning, as I stood at the end of the dusty road waiting for the school bus, I saw him again. He approached hesitantly, hands shoved deep into his pockets. I offered a nod, and he returned it with a faint smile. We stood in silence, the only sounds being the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Over the next week, our silent companionship became a routine. We'd wait for the bus together, exchange brief glances, but words remained scarce. I learned his name was Ethan from the bus driver during roll call. He rarely spoke, and I respected his quiet nature, sensing there was more beneath the surface. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, I saw Ethan's father for the first time. He was a tall, imposing figure with a stern face etched with deep lines, perhaps from years of hard labor or unspoken burdens. His eyes were cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the evening. He rarely interacted with the other residents, often retreating into their camper, the door closing with a definitive thud. Life in the RV park was simple. Mornings were filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the soft murmur of radios playing country tunes. Evenings brought the laughter of children playing tag and the occasional barbecue, with neighbors sharing stories and food. Despite the sense of community, there was an unspoken rule to mind one's own business, a respect for privacy that everyone adhered to. One afternoon, as the bus dropped us off at our usual spot, A thick plume of dark smoke curled into the sky from the direction of Ethan's camper. The acrid smell of burning plastic and wood filled the air, stinging my nostrils. Panic surged through me as I glanced at Ethan, whose face had turned ashen. Without a word, we both sprinted towards the source. As we rounded the corner, the sight was devastating. Flames engulfed the camper, their fiery tongues licking the sky. Neighbors had gathered, some with garden hoses, futilely trying to douse the inferno. The heat was intense, pushing us back. I saw the park manager, a stout woman with graying hair, guiding Ethan away from the scene, her face a mask of concern. "Ethan, stay with me," she urged, leading him towards the office. He followed mechanically, his eyes never leaving the burning wreckage that had been his home. I stood there, helpless, as firefighters arrived, their sirens piercing the chaotic scene. They worked swiftly, but the camper was beyond saving. Whispers spread through the crowd about the cause of the fire, but no one had any concrete answers. That evening, I returned home, my mind heavy with worry for Ethan. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, eyes red from recent tears. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of sorrow and apprehension. "Mom, did you hear about the fire?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "There's more, honey. Ethan's mother, she's missing." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. "Missing? How? When?" "Apparently, she was last seen this morning. No one knows where she is. The police are involved now." A cold chill ran down my spine. The pieces didn't fit together, and a sense of dread settled in my stomach. The following days were a blur of police cars, questioning neighbors, and a palpable tension that gripped the RV park. Ethan stayed with the park manager, his demeanor more withdrawn than ever. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but the barrier of unspoken words and his isolating silence held me back. One evening, as the cicadas sang their mournful tune, I overheard a conversation between my parents. Their voices were hushed, but the thin walls of our camper did little to muffle the words. "They found her," my father said, his tone grave. "Where?" my mother whispered. "Near the old gas station off the highway. It was brutal. She was tortured, burned, and decapitated." A gasp escaped my mother's lips. "And the husband?" "Arrested. They believe he found out she was giving money to someone, and he snapped." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The horrific details painted a gruesome picture in my mind. The thought of Ethan, oblivious to the fate of his mother, tore at my heart. Days turned into weeks. The once lively atmosphere of the RV park was now overshadowed by the tragedy. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, casting sympathetic glances towards Ethan, who remained a ghostly presence, drifting silently from place to place. One afternoon, I found him sitting alone on a weathered picnic bench near the playground, staring blankly at the ground. Summoning my courage, I approached and sat beside him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." He didn't respond, his eyes hollow and distant. I wanted to tell him everything, to let him know the truth, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat with him, offering the only support I could, my silent companionship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, I made a silent vow. I would be there for Ethan, in whatever capacity he needed, for as long as it took. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with pain, but I hoped that, together, we could navigate the darkness and find a glimmer of light. I was 10 years old the summer my grandmother took me to visit my uncle in upstate New York. It was the 1980s, though I don't remember exactly which year. My memories of that time are scattered, small flashes of the long car ride up, my grandmother humming along to the radio, the smell of roadside diners when we stopped to eat. But I do remember the house. It sat on a quiet road, with dense woods on one side and an old cemetery on the other. It wasn't a big cemetery, not like the ones with rows and rows of polished marble headstones. This one was small, uneven, the ground covered in thick grass that grew up between the leaning, moss-covered stones. Some of the markers were so worn down that the names had almost disappeared. Others had cracks running through them, as if they had barely survived more than a century of harsh winters and forgotten upkeep. The house itself wasn't much, just a simple, weathered building with chipped white paint and a sagging porch. My uncle lived there with a few other guys, but during the day, when they were all off at work, It was just me and my grandmother. It was quiet then, peaceful in a way that made the place feel almost separate from the world. I spent most of my time on the porch, sitting in this old wicker swing chair that hung from the ceiling by thick chains. It had a dome shape, almost like a nest, and I would curl up inside it with comic books, swinging gently back and forth while the summer air wrapped around me. The chair creaked with every movement, a rhythmic sound that blended into the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of cicadas. Some days, the air would feel heavy, thick with humidity. Other days, a cool breeze would drift through the trees, stirring the leaves and carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I remember the way the sunlight dappled the porch floor through the trees, how the shadows shifted as the day passed, stretching and shrinking like slow-moving tides. It was on one of those quiet, uneventful afternoons that I first saw him. Through the screen door, I caught a glimpse of a man sitting on the couch inside the house. He was wearing a black and red flannel shirt, his thick black hair slightly unkempt, a full beard covering the lower half of his face. He was just sitting there, relaxed, like he belonged. I didn't think much of it. My uncle had roommates, and people were always coming and going. It wasn't unusual to see someone new hanging around. I finished the comic I was reading, set it aside, and decided to go inside to grab another one. When I stepped through the door, the couch was empty. At first, I figured he must have gotten up and gone to another room. The house wasn't that big, but there were still plenty of places someone could go without me noticing. I walked down the short hallway, glancing into the bedrooms and the kitchen, but no one was there. The place was completely still, the air inside cool compared to the heat outside. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the faint sound of my grandmother moving around in the back room, humming to herself as she folded laundry. I felt a slight chill, but I shook it off. I was 10. I wasn't the type to get spooked over nothing. I figured maybe I had just imagined the guy, or maybe I had seen a reflection in the screen door, some weird trick of the light. I went back to the porch, picked up another comic, and forgot about it. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of lazy afternoons and long, quiet evenings. My uncle and his roommates would come home from work, and the house would fill with the sound of voices, laughter, the clatter of dishes as they made dinner. I liked listening to them talk, even if I didn't always understand what they were laughing about. They seemed older, but not like adults. More like grown-up kids, the kind that could do whatever they wanted. I never told anyone about the man in the flannel shirt. Not because I was scared, but because it didn't seem important. I never saw him again, and after a while, the memory faded into the background, just another small, meaningless moment in a long summer of quiet days. Then, more than 40 years later, I found out the truth. It was a family dinner, one of those rare occasions when everyone got together in the same place. My uncle had come down to visit, and we were all sitting around a table at some restaurant, eating and talking about the past. At some point, the conversation drifted to that old house in upstate New York. My uncle started reminiscing about the place, talking about the cemetery, the weird layout of the house, the way it always seemed a little too quiet. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. He started telling us about the ghost stories. Not in a serious way. He was laughing as he talked, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he had ever put any stock in that kind of thing. He mentioned how one of his roommates had moved out after seeing two kids outside the kitchen window, motioning for her to come out and play. How, when she went outside to look for them, she found nothing but two small grave markers, the names so old and worn that they were barely readable. Then he talked about the man. "I used to see him all the time," he said, still smiling, "always out of the corner of my eye, sitting on the couch while I was watching TV. Every time I turned to look at him, he'd be gone." I had been in the middle of eating when he said that. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the plate. My jaw went slack, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I must have gone pale because everyone suddenly looked at me with concern, asking if I was okay, if I needed to step outside. It took me a minute to gather myself, to find the words to explain why I had reacted like that. And when I finally told them about the man I had seen sitting on that same couch, wearing the same flannel shirt, with the same thick black hair and beard, the table fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. My uncle just stared at me, his face unreadable. When he finally did speak, his voice was quieter than before. "Huh." That was all he said. Just "huh." We never talked about it again. It wasn't that we were scared. Neither of us had ever felt anything bad in that house. The man, whoever he was, hadn't done anything. He had just been there, like a shadow lingering in the corner of a place long forgotten. But still, after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not because I thought he was a ghost, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in more than 40 years, I realized that maybe, just maybe, some things in life don't have an explanation. And maybe they don't need one. I was 13 years old when my father was found dead in his apartment. It was January 15th, 2012. He had been lying there for nearly a month before someone finally noticed. I don't remember exactly how I felt when I first heard the news. Shock, maybe. A strange, hollow numbness. I had barely seen him in the years leading up to his death. He had been an alcoholic, drinking himself into isolation, and by the time I started thinking about reconnecting, it was too late. They say you never forget where you were when you hear life-changing news. I was sitting at the dinner table with my mother and stepfather when she got the call. My stepfather was quiet, shoveling food into his mouth like nothing had happened. My mother's hands trembled as she listened. Then she broke. The sobs were instant, sharp, and painful to hear. I should have felt something stronger, but I just sat there, watching tears fall from her face and into the spaghetti bolognese she had made. A part of me had already accepted that I would never have a normal relationship with my father. He had been gone in one way or another for a long time. His absence had already shaped my life. The real horror wasn't that he had died. It was that he had been alone in that apartment for a month before someone realized he was missing. That's what stayed with me. The idea that someone could disappear so completely that no one even noticed. For days after that dinner, my mother sat at the same table and cried again. But this time, it wasn't about my father. She had gone in for a routine mammogram. I barely understood what that meant at the time, but I knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the room. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from me, shaking. I thought she was still crying over my father. My stepfather was next to me, silent. I asked her if she was okay. She wasn't. She told me they had found something in her right breast. Cancer. I don't remember how I reacted. I think I just stared at the bookshelf behind her. My brain refused to process it. For days ago, I lost my father. Now my mother might be dying too. It wasn't until later that I found out her chances of survival were only 40%. I watched her get weaker with every treatment. The radiation took her hair first. She had been so careful with her appearance before, always neat, always put together. But the chemo didn't care. It stripped everything away. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, in the way her skin paled, in how her body shrank inside her clothes. I remember thinking she looked so small, so fragile, like a different person. But she survived. Somehow she made it through. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. I have an older brother. These days, he's a drug addict. Back then, he was just lost. He spent that New Year's Eve partying in his apartment with his girlfriend and some friends. My mom, my stepfather, and I were there too. I remember feeling completely out of place, surrounded by drunk people, wishing I were anywhere else. At some point, my brother walked past me. He had been ignoring me all night, which wasn't unusual. But then suddenly he stopped. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he was seeing something I couldn't. He stared at me for a few long seconds before he said something that still haunts me. Call your father. I don't know why I listened to him. I had no real contact with my father at that point. I wanted to rebuild something, sure, but I didn't expect anything. Still, I pulled out my phone and called. It went to voicemail. His voice was there, recorded, waiting. That was the last time I ever heard it. I would later find out that my father was already dead when I made that call. He had been dead for weeks. He was lying in that apartment, rotting, while I stood in my brother's living room, listening to his voice on a machine. I don't know how my brother knew. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. I went there once. After they found his body, after the coroner took him away, someone had to go to his apartment. Someone had to clean up. I don't know why I went. Maybe I needed to see it for myself, to make it real. The smell hit me first. Even though the body was gone, the stench of death clung to the walls. I felt it in my throat, thick and suffocating. The air was heavy, stale, like the room itself had been abandoned for longer than a month. His couch was still there. That's where he had spent his last days. That's where he died. He was 49. His organs had failed him. Alcoholism, they said. He drank himself to death. I remember standing there, looking at that couch, trying to imagine his last moments. Did he know he was dying? Did he feel it creeping in, or did it just happen? Was he scared? Was he alone? I didn't stay long. I couldn't. My stepfather was a drunk too. Not the kind who drank quietly, who passed out on the couch and stayed there. No, he was the kind who let his rage take over, the kind who made every night a war zone. He had been like that since 2010. He kept going until 2017. 7 years of screaming. 7 years of broken glass, of overturned furniture, of police visits that never changed anything. 7 years of my mother making excuses for him. She lost her hair, and he still hit her. I fought him at first. That didn't work. Then I fought my mother, trying to make her see, trying to make her leave. That didn't work either. Eventually, I just felt trapped. The worst part wasn't the nights he came home drunk and violent. It wasn't the bruises or the shattered dishes or the sound of my mother sobbing. It was the waiting, lying in bed, staring at the strip of light under my door, listening for his footsteps, for my mother's voice, for the sound of something breaking. It was knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it. The police stopped coming after a while. They gave up. So did I. No one ever asked how I was doing. No one ever cared about what all of this was doing to me. But somehow I made it through school. I graduated at the top of my class. On the night of my graduation, I stood in front of an audience and gave a speech. I talked about the things we don't see, the things we ignore. I was screaming for help, but no one heard me. Everyone congratulated me afterward, smiling, shaking my hand, telling me how inspiring my words were. My mother left the room before I even finished speaking. She knew what I was talking about. That night, I decided I couldn't stay. I left everything behind. I moved 20,000 kilometers away to Australia, as far from home as I could get. It's been years now. I've built a life here. People who meet me now don't know where I came from. They don't know what I've seen. They don't know that some nights, I still wake up expecting to hear glass breaking, that I still see my father's couch in my dreams. They don't know that part of me will always be 13 years old, sitting at that dinner table, watching my mother's tears fall into her spaghetti, realizing for the first time that life doesn't care if you're ready for it or not. Because it isn't fair, and it never will be. But I survived. That has to count for something. I don't think I'll ever know what could have happened that night if I'd reacted differently. I think about it more often than I want to, about how small choices can change everything, about how the wrong kind of fear can be dangerous. It was 2004, and I was living in a second-floor apartment in Texas with my roommate. We were both in our 20s, both working and doing what we could to enjoy that strange space between being young and feeling like an adult. The apartment wasn't anything fancy. It was just a simple 2-bedroom unit in a basic complex. Beige walls, thin carpet, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors through the vents and knew when someone down the hall had burned their dinner. The living room had a sliding glass door that led out onto a small balcony. It wasn't huge, just enough for a couple of chairs and a potted plant I kept forgetting to water. The complex had metal staircases that led up to the second-floor units, but the balconies didn't have any built-in ladders or anything. It never occurred to me to worry about someone climbing up. It seemed too high, too inconvenient. It was a warm night. I remember that. Warm enough that I'd left the balcony door open to let in the breeze, hoping it would cool the apartment down a little. My roommate had already gone to bed, and I was alone in my room. The bedroom was small, just enough space for a bed, a dresser, and a small desk shoved against the wall. My cat was somewhere in the apartment, probably curled up in the living room or watching the world from the balcony. I wasn't asleep yet. The lights were still on. I was lying on my side, facing the door, comfortable, relaxed, not thinking about anything important. I was aware of the soft sounds of the apartment, the faint hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the building settling. Then I heard something different. It wasn't loud, just the softest push of the bedroom door opening. It was the kind of sound that wouldn't normally mean anything, something I wouldn't have even noticed if I'd been asleep. I assumed it was my cat coming into the room. That had happened before. The door never latched properly, so if it wasn't fully closed, it would just drift open with the weight of a push. I waited, expecting to feel the familiar weight of my cat jumping onto the bed, but nothing happened. I glanced up, and there was a man standing at the foot of my bed. I don't know how to explain what happened in my mind at that moment. It was as if my brain just refused to catch up. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. He wasn't supposed to be there, so for a few seconds, my mind just rejected the whole thing outright. I stared at him. He stared at me. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just lay there, my body locked in place, trying to understand what was happening. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't lunging toward me. He just stood there, looking down at me, his posture strange, like he was waiting for something. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe a second. Maybe 10. Then I spoke. I don't know why I said anything. Maybe because silence felt worse. Maybe because I thought, somehow, that making this a conversation instead of a confrontation would keep me safe. I asked, "What are you doing here?" His mouth opened immediately, words spilling out too fast for me to catch all of them. Spanish. My brain struggled to keep up. I spoke some Spanish, not fluently, but enough to pick up words and phrases. Enough to get by. He was saying something about trust. That I could trust him. That he wasn't going to hurt me. I didn't believe him. I sat up slowly. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I kept my face blank. I kept my voice even. I stood up. He didn't move. I took a step forward, forcing myself to keep breathing, forcing my body to stay calm. He wasn't acting aggressive. He wasn't reaching for me. He was still talking, his words fast, insistent. I nodded, pretending to listen. Then I gestured toward the door, the one that led to the living room. He hesitated. I nodded again, trying to look calm, trying to seem like I wasn't panicking. "Come on," I motioned, my voice still steady somehow. And he followed me. I walked through the apartment, feeling every single step, feeling how open everything was, how close he was behind me. He was still talking, but I wasn't processing it anymore. I could only think about the front door, about the lock, about the handle that suddenly felt a million miles away. I reached for it, turned it, pulled it open. I stepped aside, motioning for him to go. And he did. He walked out, still talking, his voice never changing, never rising. He didn't fight. He didn't hesitate. He just stepped onto the landing, and I closed the door behind him. I locked it. I stood there, my hands still on the knob, my breath caught in my throat. And then I ran to the balcony door. It was open, just like I'd left it. The realization hit me all at once. He had climbed up. I stood there, staring at the railing, at the dark night beyond it. My stomach clenched. The second floor wasn't that high, but it wasn't low either. He had pulled himself up over the edge, climbed up onto my balcony, stepped inside my home like he had every right to be there. I slammed the door shut, locked it, checked it again, just to be sure. My body started to shake. My hands, my legs, my entire frame trembling, so hard I thought I might collapse. I went back to my room, my brain still refusing to fully catch up, still trying to understand how close I had been to something I didn't even want to think about. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I told my roommate. I told a few people. They were horrified, of course. Told me how lucky I was, told me I should call someone. I didn't know what to say to that. What could I even report? He hadn't attacked me. He hadn't hurt me. He hadn't even tried to force me to do anything. But that didn't make it okay. That didn't make it any less terrifying. I started locking the balcony door after that. Every night. Every time I left the room. Every time I left the apartment. It became a ritual, a reflex. But I never stopped wondering. Who was he? Why was he there? What would have happened if I had screamed? If I had fought? If I had reacted with panic instead of control? I'll never know. And that's what scares me the most. I was too young to understand just how dangerous the world really was. When you're little, you don't think about things like crime or bad people. You don't think about what could happen if you're left alone in a car at 4 in the morning. You just follow what your parents tell you, listen to your older siblings, and sleep when you're tired. That's all I was thinking about that night, sleep. Nothing more. My parents worked delivering newspapers to the neighborhoods near ours, and they had been doing it for as long as I could remember. Every night, they'd wake up long before the sun, pack up stacks of papers, and head out to drop them off at houses and businesses. My 2 older sisters and I were always asleep when they left, but for some reason, they didn't want to leave us alone at home that night. Maybe it was a gut feeling, or maybe they had heard about something happening nearby. Some crime, some break-in, something that made them feel uneasy about leaving 3 sleeping kids alone in the house. Whatever it was, they decided to bring us with them. I didn't fight it. I was too groggy to care. I remember the cold air hitting me as they woke us up. It was still dark out, and everything felt strange, the way things do when you wake up at a time you're not supposed to. I barely even opened my eyes as I was shuffled into the car. I think my sisters were a little more awake than me, but I could barely keep my head up. The exhaustion weighed down on me like a blanket, and the second I curled up in the back seat, I passed out again. I don't know how long I slept. Could have been minutes. Could have been an hour. All I know is that I went from complete unconsciousness to total confusion in an instant. I woke up to screaming. Not just any screaming, the kind that yanks you out of sleep so violently that your heart starts pounding before your brain even catches up. My whole body jolted awake, and for a moment, I didn't even understand where I was. The car was moving. The car wasn't supposed to be moving. My parents weren't inside. It was supposed to be parked, sitting still, but it wasn't. It was going fast. Too fast. And my sisters were screaming. I turned my head, still groggy, still confused, trying to figure out what was happening. And that's when I saw him. A man. I could barely see his face in the dim streetlights passing by, but I knew he wasn't my dad. I knew he wasn't supposed to be in the driver's seat. The car jerked as he tried to keep control of it, and something heavy slid across the floor, newspapers. We always had them in the car, stacked up and bundled tight, ready to be delivered. Then I realized what was happening. Someone had stolen the car, with us inside it. I froze. My whole body locked up, and my brain refused to process it. It didn't make sense. Things like this didn't happen to people like us. They happened in movies. They happened on the news. Not to me. Not to my sisters. Not in our town. Not in our parents' car. But it was happening. And then something happened that I think saved us. My oldest sister, who had been screaming, suddenly shot up from her seat. She must have been asleep like me, but she had woken up faster, understood faster. I saw her move forward, trying to get a better look at the driver. The car swerved slightly as the man noticed her. He hadn't known we were there. He had stolen the car thinking it was empty, just an easy target, sitting in a parking lot in the middle of the night. But now, there were 3 kids in the back, one of them screaming right in his ear. She screamed again, and this time the man panicked. I saw his shoulders jolt, his head snapped to the side. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't prepared for this. And then the stack of newspapers, maybe he had kicked them, maybe he had knocked them over when he moved, tipped forward, spilling onto his lap, his arms, the floor beneath his feet. I think that's what did it. He must have realized he wasn't going to get away with this. The car jerked hard, too hard, and suddenly, it wasn't moving anymore. The tires screeched against the pavement, the smell of burnt rubber filling the air as the car came to a violent stop. The door flung open, and he was gone, just like that. For a second, everything was quiet. Too quiet. It was like the whole world had stopped along with the car. Then the reality of what had just happened crashed down on all of us. My mom was there. My dad was there. My sisters were crying. My mom was crying. And I just sat there, not knowing how to react. The police came. There were questions, lots of them, but I barely remember what was said. I was too young to fully grasp what had almost happened. At the time, it was just something that had happened in the middle of the night. Something weird, something scary, but not something I understood the way my parents did. I didn't understand until I got older, until I thought about how easy it would have been for him to keep driving. How easy it would have been for him to take us somewhere we'd never be found. How, if my sister hadn't woken up when she did, I might not be here to even tell this story. It still unsettles me to think about it. How close I was to disappearing without ever knowing it was happening. I don't know what happened to that man. I never saw his face clearly, and I never found out if the police caught him. But I still think about him sometimes, and I wonder if he ever thinks about us. Physics was never my favorite subject, but it was a requirement, and I was stuck with it. The last class of the day. The final stretch before freedom. That's what it always felt like. Just one more lecture, one more problem set, and then I could get in my car and head home. The classroom smelled of old textbooks and stale coffee. A projector hummed in the background as the professor scrawled equations across the whiteboard, his voice a steady drone. I wasn't paying much attention. My eyes kept drifting to the clock mounted high on the wall, ticking away at an agonizingly slow pace. It was a beautiful day outside. The sun was bright, the sky was a deep, endless blue, and I wanted to be anywhere but stuck in that classroom. My fingers tapped against the desk in impatience. I checked my watch again. 5 minutes to go. My stomach growled softly. I knew my mom would have supper waiting when I got home. She always did. A home-cooked meal after a long day of classes was one of the few things that kept me going. The final few minutes dragged on, but eventually, the professor dismissed us. I shot out of my seat before he had even finished erasing the board. The parking lot was nearly empty when I reached my car. Most students had already left, their days ending much earlier than mine. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and let the familiar hum of the engine settle me. I had a 20-mile drive ahead of me, mostly along quiet country roads. It wasn't a bad drive, peaceful even. I had driven it countless times, knew every turn, every dip in the road, every high point where I could get a clear CB radio signal. I was a CB and electronics enthusiast. It was a hobby I had picked up years ago. I had a radio set up in my car, and I used it to check in with my family on the way home. A simple call to let them know I was on my way. It was a habit, something I did without thinking. As I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, I reached for the radio mic. The first high point of my drive was just ahead. I keyed the mic and called home. No answer. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes the signal didn't carry well, or my family was in another room and didn't hear the radio. I wasn't concerned. I'd try again at the next high spot. The drive was smooth, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the fields. Late summer, the air still warm, but carrying the first hints of autumn. I reached the second high point and tried again. Still no answer. That was a little odd. My family never missed a call. It had become part of our routine. Even if they were busy, someone would always pick up. I reached the third high spot. Nothing. A quiet unease settled over me. Maybe something was wrong with my radio. I adjusted the knobs, checked the connections, but everything seemed fine. The signal should have been strong. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky as I neared the final stretch of my drive. My town came into view from the top of the last hill. From this vantage point, I could see almost everything: the rooftops, the water tower, the narrow streets. I called home again. Nothing. At this point, my stomach was tight with unease. I kept calling the entire way down the hill, right up to my driveway. That's when I saw it. The front door was wide open. I hit the brakes hard. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stared at the house. From where I sat in the car, I could see straight through the living room to the back door, which was also open. Something was wrong. I killed the engine, threw open the door, and sprinted inside, calling for my mom, for anyone. Silence. The house was empty. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the fact that no one was there. The furniture was undisturbed. The TV remote was in its usual spot. A book lay open on the coffee table, as if someone had just been reading it. But there was no sign of my mother, no sound of dinner cooking in the kitchen, no distant hum of the radio. I ran through the house, checking every room, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. Panic started to creep in. My mother never left the doors open like this. If she had gone out, the doors would have been locked. The house would have been secure. I ran out the back door, my breath coming in short bursts. And there she was, standing in the yard, hanging laundry on the clothesline, as if nothing was wrong. Relief washed over me so hard I felt weak. I walked toward her, my chest still heaving, trying to make sense of everything. She looked at me, surprised, and said something that made my stomach twist all over again. "You're home early." I shook my head, checked my watch. No, I wasn't. I had left at the normal time. My physics class had ended as usual. I had driven straight home. But something was off. We went inside. I checked the wall clock, then the one in the kitchen, then the one in the living room. They were all nearly 2 hours behind my watch. I checked the microwave, the stove, every single clock in the house, all behind. It didn't make sense. My watch had been in sync with the classroom clock when I left. I was sure of it. There hadn't been a power outage. If there had been, the clocks would have reset, not just fallen behind. And even if they had lost time, why would every clock in the house be exactly the same amount off? The only explanation was that my watch was wrong. But how? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall. I had somehow arrived home over an hour before my physics class had even ended. I went over everything again and again in my head. The drive was 20 miles. I hadn't taken any shortcuts. I hadn't sped. I hadn't lost time. I had been awake, alert, conscious of every turn. And yet I was here. I wondered what would happen if I pulled up at my usual time. Would I see myself arrive? Would I cease to exist? Or had something already happened that I couldn't understand? I never found an answer. To this day, I've gone over every possibility, every logical explanation, and nothing fits. There is no missing time, no blank space in my memory, only the impossible fact that I got home before I should have. I don't know what drew us to that place. Maybe it was the price, maybe it was the location. Maybe we were just too trusting, thinking a quiet getaway in Mexico would be nothing but relaxation and good food, an escape from the routines back home. I don't remember the name of the hotel anymore, and I don't want to, but I can still see every detail of it. The building was old, not run down exactly, but tired in a way that was hard to describe. The walls were thick, the kind of thick you see in older Spanish-style buildings, meant to hold in the cool air and block out the heat. The place sat on a stretch of road that didn't seem to get much traffic, and when we pulled up, it was quiet. Too quiet. There was no one outside, no movement at all. The entrance was wide open, like it was welcoming us in, but there was something unsettling about it, something I should have noticed. When we walked inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not bad, just stale. The air had that lifeless quality, like a house that had been shut up too long. The lobby was clean but empty. A single desk sat near the far wall, and behind it was a man who barely looked up when we came in. No bellhop, no other staff. No guests sitting around reading, no tourists checking in. Just us. The man at the desk was polite enough. Gave us a key without much small talk, just the basics. Room number, breakfast hours, which we'd later find out didn't matter. Checkout time. His voice was flat, like he'd done this 100 times, but didn't expect us to stay. He didn't smile, not once. We took our bags and walked down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. The floor was made of tile, cool underfoot, the kind that makes every sound seem sharper. The hallway stretched out long in front of us, lined with heavy wooden doors, all closed. Not a single sign of life. No muffled voices behind the doors, no TV sounds, no music. Just silence. Our room was in the far corner. The key was old-fashioned, the heavy brass kind you don't see much anymore. When we turned it, the lock clicked too easily, like it had been oiled recently, but never used. Inside, the room was simple. A bed, a wooden dresser, a small table with 2 chairs. A bathroom with an old mirror that had started to lose its silver in places, leaving dark patches like bruises. The windows were shut tight, the thick curtains drawn closed. When I pulled them back, the view was nothing special, just the side of another building, blank and gray. I remember looking around, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the quiet. Hotels are never truly silent. Even in the middle of the night, there are always sounds, doors closing, distant conversations, the hum of vending machines, footsteps in the hall. Here, there was nothing. We settled in, unpacked a little. The bed was stiff, the sheets clean but thin. We left the room after a while, walked around town, had dinner. The streets were normal, filled with the usual movement of locals and tourists, the sounds of laughter and conversation. Nothing felt strange out there. But when we returned to the hotel, the silence swallowed us again. It was like stepping into another world, one that had been forgotten. The first night, I slept fine. My wife didn't. I could tell in the morning by the way she moved, the tired drag in her steps. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded. The second night, I woke up once to use the bathroom. When I came back to bed, I thought I heard something in the hall. Just a faint noise, like fabric brushing against the wall. But when I listened harder, there was nothing. I told myself it was nothing. The third night is when it happened. I woke up because the light was on. Not the overhead light, just a small flashlight, the beam pointed straight at the door. My wife was sitting up in bed, her breathing slow but sharp, controlled but tense. In her hand was a can of pepper spray. I didn't move at first. I just let my eyes adjust, taking in the way she was staring, the way she was gripping the can. Then carefully I sat up too. The room felt colder than it should have. Not freezing, just off. Like the air had shifted in some way I couldn't explain. I listened, trying to pick up whatever had scared her, but all I heard was my own breathing. I didn't ask her what was wrong. I didn't need to. I could see it in her face. She was convinced someone was coming through that door. We stayed like that for a long time, just staring. My eyes kept drifting to the gap at the bottom of the door, half expecting to see shadows move across it, to hear the knob turn. But nothing happened. Eventually, the flashlight started to shake in her hand, not from fear, but from how long she had been holding it. I reached over slowly, took it from her, turned it off. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, we were packed. We didn't talk about it, didn't try to rationalize it. We just knew we weren't staying. At the front desk, the same man was there, his expression blank. He didn't ask why we were leaving early. He just took the key, nodded once, and went back to whatever he was doing. We got in the car, pulled out onto the road, and didn't look back. Later, when we told the story to someone in town, their face changed immediately. Not surprise, understanding. Like they already knew. That hotel, they told us, wasn't really a hotel. Not anymore. It was a front, a laundering scheme, some kind of cover operation. The only people who ever stayed there were the ones who didn't know better. The locals avoided it. Anyone from the area knew to stay far away. We had been the only ones there, because we weren't supposed to be there at all. I don't know what would have happened if we had stayed. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. Maybe we had just spooked ourselves over nothing. But I still remember the way she held that can of pepper spray, her knuckles white, her body rigid. She knew. Before either of us had any real reason to, she knew. And we left before we could find out why. It started as just another school lunch. A line of students shuffled forward, trays in hand, stopping at each station where lunch staff heaped servings of food onto the beige plastic trays. The cafeteria smelled like warm bread, mashed potatoes, and something vaguely fishy. It was always like that on Fridays, fish day. I stood there in line, staring at the metal tub of tuna mayo in the buffet section. The thick, pale mixture sat in a deep stainless steel container, lumpy and uneven, the color somewhere between dull gray and a sickly off-white. Bits of shredded fish stuck together in moist clumps, streaked with what looked like tiny red veins. It had been weeks since the first news broke. A human ear in a can of tuna. Not here, not at school, but somewhere else, somewhere close enough that people were talking about it. The whole thing had sounded like a messed-up urban legend at first, one of those gross-out stories kids passed around to freak each other out. But it wasn't a rumor. It had actually happened. Someone had cracked open a can of tuna, dumped it into a bowl, and found a severed human ear sitting right there among the shredded fish. The news had exploded after that. Everyone had questions. Whose ear was it? How did it get in there? Then, just a couple of weeks later, another report came out. A human finger. That's when the whole thing turned from disturbing to something far worse. Because it wasn't the same person. I remember reading about it, how the investigators said the ear and the finger belonged to different people, and how that led to a much darker realization. Nobody had been reported missing. Nobody had stepped forward to say, "Hey, I lost an ear," or "That's my finger," which meant whoever they belonged to was gone, and nobody was looking for them. At first, people thought it had to be some horrific accident at a fish factory. Maybe someone got their hand caught in a machine, and somehow, pieces of them ended up in the tuna before the mistake was noticed. But there was no recall, no warning, no announcement telling people to avoid certain brands. Just these scattered news reports and rumors. And now, here I was staring down at this tub of tuna in the lunch line, feeling my stomach twist. It was the same brand the school always used. Nobody had confirmed if the human tuna came from this specific supplier, but it was close enough to make me sick just thinking about it. My brain wouldn't stop picturing it, some unlucky worker in a fish factory, getting pulled into some kind of grinding machine, their body reduced to scraps and mixed into the fish meat, packed into metal cans, and shipped off to grocery stores and schools just like this one. I felt my appetite disappear completely. I watched the lunch lady scoop a huge spoonful of the tuna mixture and slap it onto the tray of the kid in front of me. It made a wet, slopping sound as it hit the surface. The smell, strong, fishy, slightly metallic, filled my nose. I swallowed hard. There were so many little bits in it. Some darker, some stringy. If someone had already found an ear and a finger, what else had been mixed in? What if there were more parts? What if nobody ever found them? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They hadn't found most of the two missing people. If two men had died in some accident at the plant, why had only tiny pieces of them been discovered? Where was the rest of them? The only explanation was the worst possible one. Some of them had been eaten. People had eaten human flesh without even knowing it. The thought made my legs feel weak. I took a small step back, my hands gripping the tray tightly. The kid in front of me had already moved on, and now it was my turn. I hesitated. The lunch lady stared at me. She looked tired, impatient. She'd probably been serving food all day without a second thought. To her, it was just tuna mayo. But to me, it was something else entirely. I thought about turning away, just skipping lunch altogether. But my stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I didn't want the tuna, but I needed something. I shifted to the side, grabbing a bread roll and some mashed potatoes instead. When I finally sat down at my usual table, I could still smell it. The other kids were eating, laughing, talking about normal things. But my mind was stuck on that awful thought. How many people had already eaten it? The truth didn't come out all at once. It took weeks before investigators traced the problem back to its source. The supplier was massive. They sold bulk-cooked tuna to dozens of factories and processing plants. That was the problem. So many different places handled the fish before it reached stores and schools. The pieces of human meat could have come from anywhere. Eventually, the news broke. It was a fish processing plant, a rundown, dangerous place that had been secretly hiring illegal Chinese migrants to work under horrifying conditions. These weren't normal workers. They had no papers, no records, no rights. They were trapped, forced to work in horrible conditions, using dangerous, outdated machinery that should have been scrapped years ago. I had never been the kind of person who got scared easily. Horror movies were fun, sure, but they didn't really stick with me. I wasn't one of those people who left the theater still on edge, checking the back seat of their car or peering around corners in their own house like a serial killer might be crouching there, waiting for them. No, horror was just entertainment, a bunch of flickering images on a screen. At least, that's what I told myself. We had watched Ringu the night before, *the Ringu, the Japanese original that inspired The Ring. I had never seen it before, but I knew the premise. Cursed videotape, eerie long-haired girl, people dying when she crawled out of their TV sets. A classic ghost story, but something about it was different from other horror movies. It wasn't loud or over the top like American horror flicks. It was slow, creeping, and unnerving. There was no big orchestral soundtrack that told you when to be scared. Instead, the horror seeped in slowly, like cold air through a cracked window. By the time the credits rolled, the room had gone quiet. No one spoke for a moment, and when someone finally did, it was just nervous laughter. Ha, yeah, that was creepy star. But the thing is, we all felt it. That lingering unease. Like something had stuck to us. The kind of feeling that made you hesitate before turning off the lights at night. Still, I hadn't thought much about it after leaving my friend's place. It was a movie. That's all. The next morning was completely normal. I slept in a little later than usual, woke up groggy, and spent way too long scrolling through my phone in bed before finally dragging myself to the bathroom for a shower. I liked my showers hot enough to turn the small bathroom into a sauna. By the time I stepped out, steam was clinging to the mirror, water droplets beating and running down the glass like sweat. The air was thick with leftover heat. I grabbed my towel and ran it over my arms, my face, my chest, stepping carefully onto the bath mat so I wouldn't slip. The quiet hum of the fan was the only sound as I dried off. Everything felt normal. Just another lazy morning. I wrapped the towel around my waist and padded into the living room, still rubbing my hair with the smaller towel. The couch looked inviting, so I sank into it with a satisfied sigh, stretching my legs out. The towel was still damp against my skin, and the cool air from the ceiling fan gave me a small shiver. Then, the TV turned on. The screen flared to life with a sudden blue glow, the sound of static filling the room. My body locked up, muscles tensing on pure instinct. My heart jolted. For a split second, my brain refused to make sense of it. I just sat there frozen, staring at the TV like it had personally insulted me. Then, before I could even react, the shower turned back on. A loud burst of water splattered against the tile, echoing from the bathroom down the hall. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my body tip backward, almost falling off the couch as I scrambled to my feet. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I was panicking, fully panicking, and my mind was throwing out every horrible explanation it could come up with. I had just watched Ringu. The ghost girl came out of the TV. Water dripped everywhere when she did. I knew it was just a movie. I knew. But in that moment, none of that logic mattered. Some deep, primal part of my brain was screaming, run, run, run. I whipped around, heart pounding so hard it made me lightheaded. My eyes darted between the TV and the bathroom door, still slightly ajar, steam curling out from the crack. The shower was still running. And then, I saw it. The remote. Lying right there. Under me. I had sat on it. Realization hit me like a slap to the face. I slowly reached down, picked up the remote, and turned off the TV. The static blinked out. Then, still standing in the middle of the room, breathing hard, I turned toward the bathroom. My pulse was still racing, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from embarrassment. I walked back down the hall, stepping over the bath mat, and reached into the shower. The water was still running, but as soon as I turned the knob, it stopped with a sharp click. Leftover pressure in the pipes. That was all it was. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the drain, listening to the last few droplets splatter against the tile. Then I let out a long, shaky breath and laughed. Not a normal laugh, one of those weird, breathy, I can't believe it just freaked out kind of laughs. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of secondhand embarrassment from myself. No one had even seen me freak out, but that didn't stop me from replaying the whole thing in my head over and over. The worst part, that wasn't the only weird connection I had to the movie. Later that night, after I had mostly gotten over my dumb little scare, I was scrolling through my phone when I remembered something. My ex-girlfriend's mom used to teach piano. One of her students, the actress who played the ghost girl in Ringu, her own family refused to watch the movie. I wondered if they had ever sat on a remote at the wrong time. I've worked in mining for years, long enough to know that no matter how many safety measures you put in place, accidents still happen. People get comfortable, cut corners, or just get unlucky. There are 1,000 ways to get killed underground, and when it happens, it's rarely quick or clean. I work for a company that designs and installs conveyor systems, massive, industrial belts that carry coal out of the mines. These belts run for kilometers, cutting through the dark, deep tunnels, moving at a steady 3 to 10 meters per second. Most places install emergency stop systems, like man-on-belt switches, but not all of them. In the past, miners used to ride the belts in and out of the mine, sitting on them like it was nothing. Those days are gone. Now, the machinery is guarded and controlled, but it's still just as dangerous. I never met the guy, but I heard about him. His name isn't important because, to be honest, I doubt there was much of him left when it was all over. It was an old-timer who told me about it, casually mentioning it while we were installing a new drive system on a belt. He described it like it was just another story, something that happened, something that could happen again. The guy had been doing maintenance on the conveyor, standing on the belt while it was stopped. It's common practice. Sometimes you need to inspect a section, replace a roller, or clean out buildup. He was probably alone. Most of the time, guys worked in pairs, but when deadlines were tight, or someone was on a break, you did what needed to be done. He didn't see it coming. The ceiling in the mine was lined with wire mesh, a safeguard against falling debris. Without it, rocks could come loose and drop on workers at any time. It was a good idea in theory, but in his case, it was a death trap. Something above him shifted. A section of the roof gave way. The weight of the rocks, held together by the mesh, came down on top of him. Maybe it was gradual, a few stones falling first, giving him a split second to realize what was about to happen. Or maybe it all came at once, the whole section of mesh giving way, crushing him to the belt. The mesh pinned him down, twisted and tangled around him. If it hadn't been there, he might have been able to claw his way free, push the rocks off, drag himself to the side. But the metal wires held him tight. He was trapped, completely immobilized. And then he waited. Underground, it's never truly quiet. There's always something. The distant whir of machines, the occasional creak of the tunnels settling. But when you're trapped, unable to move, the sounds around you change. They become sharper, more distinct. He must have known what was coming. The siren went off. Standard procedure. Before a conveyor starts, a loud alarm sounds, warning everyone to get clear. It gives workers time to step away, make sure nothing is in the way. It echoed through the mine, a sharp, mechanical wail bouncing off the rock walls. And he was still there. He would have felt it before he saw it. The first slow jerk of the belt as it came to life, the vibration through his body as it shuddered and began to move. He was going toward the crusher. If you've never seen a coal crusher, you don't really understand. It's not like those office paper shredders where you can fish something out at the last second. A crusher is a massive machine made up of two enormous cylinders lined with thick, curved metal spikes. These spikes hook into the coal, drag it down between the cylinders, and grind it into smaller pieces before sending it further down the line. The process is relentless. Anything that goes in doesn't come out in one piece. He would have known. He had worked around these machines for years, probably seen them in action 100 times. Maybe he tried to scream, but underground, with the sound of the belt and the machinery, no one would have heard him. Maybe he tried to fight, but the mesh held him tight. The belt wasn't fast. At 3 to 10 meters per second, it gave him time to think, time to anticipate. He was alive for all of it. There was nothing he could do but wait. Somewhere along the way, he managed to pull off his wedding ring. Maybe he had to work at it, twisting it around his finger, knowing he only had moments left. Maybe it slipped off easily, the sweat and cold dust making his fingers slick. He threw it to the side, off the belt. That's how they knew, because there was nothing else left. By the time someone realized what had happened, it was too late. The coal kept moving. The crusher did what it was designed to do. The only thing they ever found was the ring, lying off to the side of the belt, like a final message. The coal kept coming. The thing about mining is that once the process starts, it doesn't stop. The coal is scooped up, loaded onto rail cars, and transported. It's washed, processed, burned in power stations. By the time anyone figured it out, he was long gone. No body, no remains, just coal. They never stopped the operation to look. There was nothing to look for. Maybe deep down they knew. But in the end, it didn't matter. The work continued. The mine kept running. Every once in a while, someone tells the story. They talk about the guy who got caught, the guy who disappeared. Some of the older workers don't like to discuss it. Others just shrug, another mining accident, one of many. But sometimes, when I stand by the belts, watching the coal move steadily along, I think about him. About how he was just another part of the system, another piece of material carried away, lost forever in the endless flow. And I wonder how many other stories like his are buried in the dark. I grew up in a small, rural house on a quiet road. We had neighbors, but they weren't close, and at night, our property felt isolated. My bedroom was on the side of the house, next to a small shed attached to the building. The only thing separating my room from that shed was a set of glass doors. My parents mostly used the shed for storage, tools, old furniture, and random things that had no place in the house. For most of my childhood, I never thought much about it. The shed was just there, a part of the house I never really went into. But when I was around 12 or 13, something changed. I started hearing noises at night. At first, it was just soft sounds, what I assumed were animals moving around outside. That wasn't unusual. We lived in the country, so I was used to the sounds of raccoons, possums, or the occasional stray dog rustling through the grass at night. But this was different. It wasn't the random scratching or scurrying of small animals. These were footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving outside my room. Then I started seeing him. It wasn't every night, but often enough that I began dreading sunset. A dark figure would move past the glass doors, barely more than a shadow in the dim moonlight. Sometimes he would just stand there. I could see the faint outline of a person, unmoving, watching. Other times, he tried the handle of the glass door, testing it. When it didn't open, he would disappear into the dark. The first time it happened, I was frozen in fear, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the sounds of the night. I turned on my bedside lamp, and the second the light flickered on, the figure moved, quickly, disappearing from sight. I ran to my parents' room, breathless and shaking, trying to explain what I had seen. My dad groggily got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and walked outside to check. He found nothing. It was probably just a shadow, he muttered, annoyed at being woken up. But it wasn't just a shadow. It happened again, and again, almost every week, sometimes multiple nights in a row. I would wake up to the sound of movement outside the glass doors, and every time I turned on my light, the figure would vanish. But no matter how many times I told my parents, they didn't believe me. I don't blame them, looking back. There was never any proof. Nothing was ever missing, No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside the shed. To them, I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But I knew what I was seeing. I knew what I was hearing. One night, after weeks of this, I woke up to something different. The handle of the door was shaking. Not a quick test like before. This time, it was a steady, forceful rattling. Someone was really trying to open it. I bolted upright in bed, my stomach twisting into knots. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the glass, waiting, dreading what I might see. But the second I turned on my lamp, the sound stopped. And like always, when my dad checked outside, there was nothing. That was the night he lost patience with me. He was angry, tired of being woken up for what he thought was nothing. He told me to stop being dramatic. He slapped me across the face, not hard, but enough to make his frustration clear. I stopped waking them up after that. But I didn't stop hearing the footsteps. I became obsessed with the shed. During the day, when the sun was out and everything felt normal, I would go inside and inspect every inch of it, looking for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. I checked the door handle, the windows, the walls. Everything was intact. There was no sign that anyone had ever been in there at night. I started keeping track of the nights I heard the noises, writing them down in a little notebook. Patterns emerged. It was never random. It always happened on specific nights, always around the same time. The worst part was the feeling that I was losing my mind. Without proof, without anyone else witnessing it, I started doubting myself. Was it real? Had I imagined it? Was I dreaming? But no matter how much I questioned it, I couldn't shake the fear. I moved my bed in front of the glass doors. It wasn't much, but it made me feel safer. I found a piece of scrap rebar in the yard and kept it next to my bed. If he ever got in, I would be ready. Then one afternoon, months after it all started, my dad picked me up early from school. The second I saw him standing outside my classroom, my stomach dropped. I thought I was in trouble. Maybe for waking him up so many times, for making things up, for being a burden. My brain wasn't working right. I was barely sleeping at this point, constantly on edge. I couldn't think straight. We drove home in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, there were police cars outside. I panicked. My mom met us at the door, her face pale, eyes red. She pulled me inside, sat me down, and explained everything. That morning, my dad had gone into the shed to grab some tools and realized a bunch of them were missing. Chainsaws, drills, things that would be hard to misplace. At first, he assumed someone had broken in during the night, but when he mentioned it to a neighbor, the truth came out. The neighbor's son, a guy in his late teens, had been stealing. Not just stealing. The police searched his room and found all the missing tools, along with something else. Photographs. Of me. Pictures of me outside. Pictures of me at school. Pictures of me in my bedroom, taken through the glass doors. It had been him. He had been coming to the shed for months, watching me, trying to get inside. The tools weren't even the main reason he was there. He only started stealing after the fact, after he had already been sneaking into the shed for God knows how long. I felt sick. The police asked me questions. I answered them the best I could. I told them everything, the footsteps, the figure outside my door, the shaking handle. They recorded everything I said, but I never had to go to court. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him. I never wanted to know. After everything, my parents felt awful. They apologized over and over, but there was nothing to be done about it now. I was just relieved it was over. For the first time in months, I slept without waking up in terror. I still thought about it, though. I still thought about what might have happened if I had been a heavy sleeper. If I hadn't woken up when he tried the door. If the lock had been weak. If he had ever actually gotten inside. But I tried not to dwell on it. Instead, I focused on the one good thing that came out of it. After months of begging, my parents finally let me get pet mice. I got a little brown one and named him Paprika, Pappy for short. He lived for 6 years, and I loved him more than anything. That whole experience shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until I was older. It made me more cautious, more aware. And it made me realize I wanted to work with animals. It was the only good thing to come out of those terrifying months. And even now, years later, I still can't look at glass doors at night without feeling watched. I never liked night shifts at camp. During the day, the place felt alive, kids running around, counselors leading activities, the lake full of splashing and laughter. But at night, when the lanterns and campfires were out, the entire place felt different. The cabins, scattered across the property, seemed isolated. The forest pressed in on all sides, just a dark wall of trees beyond the floodlights near the dining hall. And out past the gravel road, beyond the main entrance, was nothing. No houses, no streetlights, just miles and miles of Vermont wilderness. I never thought about how remote we were during the day. But during the night shift, when it was just me, Gabe, and a few other counselors spread out across the camp to make sure the kids didn't sneak out, the isolation settled in. There was no cell service unless you hiked up to the ridge, and even then, it was spotty. We had no real security. No gates. Just a wooden sign near the entrance with the camp's name, and a dirt parking lot big enough for the camp vans and a few staff cars. If someone really wanted to walk in from the road, there was nothing stopping them. That night, Gabe and I were assigned to watch the girls' cabins. Usually, it was an easy shift, just walking around, listening for noises, checking to make sure none of the older kids were sneaking out to meet up. We weren't expecting anything weird. But around 1:30 a.m., we saw someone walking toward the cabins. At first, we thought it was just one of the older guys from the boys' side, maybe waking up a girl's cabin to sneak out. We'd caught kids trying before, dumb teenage stuff, sneaking out to the lake or the woods to try and scare each other. But as we got closer, I realized something was off. The figure was tall, wearing all black. Not a camp hoodie, not pajama pants, just black from head to toe. The way he moved was slow, deliberate. He wasn't running or sneaking, just walking in a straight line toward the cabins like he belonged there. Gabe must have noticed it too, because he whispered, "That's not a camper." We picked up the pace, jogging over, our flashlights bobbing in the dark. "Hey," Gabe called. The figure stopped. He turned his head slightly, just enough to let us know he'd heard. But instead of answering, he bolted. And I mean bolted. 1 second he was standing there, the next he was sprinting toward the parking lot, moving faster than I thought possible. Gabe reacted immediately, taking off after him. I hesitated, my heart hammering, my brain trying to process what was happening. Then I followed, but Gabe was already yards ahead of me. The guy had a head start, but Gabe was fast. He caught up to him just as he reached the edge of the lot and tackled him to the ground. By the time I got there, Gabe had the guy pinned. The dude was struggling, twisting, trying to break free. His hood had slipped halfway off, but I still couldn't see his face. I was trying to pull my phone out, fumbling to get service so I could call someone, anyone, and then the guy punched Gabe in the face. It wasn't a wild, panic swing. It was controlled, precise. He knew how to fight. Gabe grunted and let go for a second, just enough for the guy to scramble to his feet. Before either of us could react, he sprinted toward his car, a dark-colored sedan at the far end of the lot. He knew exactly where it was. He had parked far from the other vehicles, as if he'd planned an escape route. I was still trying to get a signal as he yanked the door open, threw himself inside, and peeled out of the lot, gravel kicking up behind him. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there, breathing hard, the cold air stinging my lungs. Gabe was holding his face, swearing under his breath. My hands were shaking. I still couldn't get a signal. We had no license plate, no name, nothing. Just a man in black who had been walking toward the girls' cabins in the middle of nowhere at 1:30 a.m. We had no idea what to do. The camp director's cabin was on the other side of the property. Waking him up would mean running through the woods, and neither of us wanted to go anywhere alone after what just happened. The only thing we could think to do was head to the food hall, which was well lit and had a landline phone. We sat there for the rest of our shift, the camp silent around us. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's shadowy figure walking toward the cabins. I thought about how confidently he had moved. He hadn't been confused. He hadn't been wandering. He had known exactly where he was going. And that's what scared me the most. By morning, we told the camp director everything. He was shaken but tried to downplay it, saying it was probably some lost hiker or a hunter who got turned around. But that guy wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was going, and we never saw him again. I don't remember exactly when I first heard it. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It wasn't something that stood out right away, just a faint sound, easy to brush off. It would happen late at night, when everything was still and quiet, when I was winding down from the day. Sometimes I'd be lying in bed, scrolling on my phone or listening to music, and I'd hear it. A voice, Singing. Soft at first, just a gentle hum in the background, like someone playing music in another room. I thought it was my headset the first time, maybe some interference from the Xbox. I pulled it off and listened. Nothing. Then I checked my record player, even though it wasn't plugged in. Nothing. I picked up my phone. Nothing. The radio. Nothing. But I could still hear it. Some nights, it was clearer than others. A slow, rhythmic tune like a lullaby. A man's voice. No words, just drawn-out notes, stretching and fading into the quiet. It sent chills down my spine, but I always found some way to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor was playing music outside. Maybe it was a weird trick of the wind. Maybe I was just imagining things. Then came the thumping. It started small, just a dull, distant knock. I didn't think much of it at first. Houses settle. Wood shifts. Pipes creak. But this wasn't the normal kind of noise a house makes at night. It was steady, purposeful. Sometimes it would happen right when the singing stopped, a single knock beneath my floorboards. Sometimes it would come in pairs, like a heartbeat. Thump, thump. The first time I really paid attention to it, I was sitting on the couch, playing a game with my headset on. I took a sip of my drink, and that's when I heard it, muffled but close. I paused the game and listened. Thump. It came from beneath me. I stood up slowly. My living room had a crawl space underneath, just a couple of feet of empty space between the floor and the earth. I had never thought much about it before. It was just there, a forgotten part of the house. I moved toward the kitchen, listening. Thump. It was beneath the floor again. I told myself it was probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A stray cat. Something had probably gotten in. But the thing is, the thumping wasn't random. It wasn't the scurrying of tiny feet or the scratching of claws. It was deliberate, measured, like someone knocking. I tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered. Every few nights, I'd hear it again. Sometimes the singing, sometimes the thumping, sometimes both. I thought about checking the crawl space, but every time I considered it, I found an excuse not to. The entrance was outside, hidden behind a bush. It had probably been sealed shut for years. If an animal had gotten in, I'd deal with it eventually. Then one night, my dog lost her mind. I had just crawled into bed, still hearing the faint hum of singing beneath me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone, when suddenly she bolted into my room. She wasn't just barking, she was snarling, growling deep in her throat, her ears pinned back. She lunged toward the floor, pawing at the carpet, digging furiously. Every hair on my body stood up. I grabbed her by the collar and pulled her away, dragging her out of the room. She was still barking, trying to twist out of my grip, her whole body tense. My heart was hammering in my chest. I shoved her into the hallway and shut the door, then stood there, breathing heavily, listening. Silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It was thick, heavy, like something was waiting. I grabbed my gun. I sat on my bed with my rifle across my lap, my dog whining outside my door. I stayed like that all night, gripping the gun so tightly my fingers ached. The house was dead silent now, not even the creak of settling wood. I kept waiting for something to happen. A sound, a movement, but nothing came. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, still holding the rifle. When I woke up, the sun was rising. My back ached from sleeping upright, my fingers stiff from gripping the gun all night. My dog was curled up outside my door, ears twitching as she slept. I felt drained, but more than that, I felt done. I needed to check the crawl space. I stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The yard was quiet, the trees standing still. I walked along the side of the house, toward the overgrown bush that covered the crawlspace entrance. I grabbed a pair of clippers from the shed and started cutting. The branches were thick, but I worked quickly. I had a sick feeling in my stomach, a deep, crawling dread. When I finally cleared the bush away, I saw it, a wooden door, old and weathered, with a rusty latch. My hands were shaking as I unlatched it. The door creaked open. A damp, musty smell hit me. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it inside. The space was cramped, barely tall enough for someone to crawl through. The dirt floor was uneven, littered with leaves and debris. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. There was a makeshift bed, just a wooden pallet with blankets piled on top. Next to it, a teddy bear, a trash bag filled with clothes, a pile of Legos, and a bunch of shoes. My shoes. Shoes I had thrown away months ago. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. Someone had been living here, right beneath me, listening, watching. Then I turned my head and saw the camera. It was small, barely noticeable in the dim light, propped up on a stack of bricks. I picked it up with trembling hands and backed out of the crawlspace, slamming the door shut. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I went inside, grabbing my old laptop. I plugged in the camera and opened the files. The first video played. The screen was dark at first, then shifted as the camera moved, showing trees. My trees. Someone was walking through the woods, the camera bobbing with each step. The video cut, then came back, this time inside the crawlspace. A man sat there in the dark, humming, singing. My stomach clenched. The next video played. I heard my own voice. The camera was facing the ceiling, the wooden beams of my floor visible. Footsteps, my footsteps, moved above. Then the voice came, soft and mocking. "Oh, he's about to take a shower." I felt bow rise in my throat. Another video. A different night. I saw myself through my own bedroom window, completely unaware. Then came the voice again. "Hope to hear him fuck." I shut the laptop. My hands were shaking. My vision blurred with panic and rage. I grabbed the camera and smashed it against the floor. Again and again until the plastic cracked, until the lens shattered. I deleted the files. I ripped the memory card apart. Then I went outside and bolted the crawlspace door shut. That night, I heard the singing again. I barely had time to react before my dog started barking, louder and angrier than ever. I grabbed my gun and ran to the window. There he was, a figure crouched by the crawlspace door, yanking at the lock. I flipped on the porch light. The man flinched, his face snapping toward me. I couldn't see his features clearly, just the wild, desperate look in his movements. My dog was losing her mind, barking and snarling. The man let out a furious, frustrated noise, then ran. I burst out onto the porch, gun raised, heart pounding, but he was already disappearing into the woods. The trees swallowed him whole, his dark shape vanishing into the night. I never saw him again, but I never forgot.